The Tanzimat had promised renewal. Two sultans had given everything they had to make that promise real. One through iron and justice, one through mercy and reform. And for a moment, it had almost worked. But empires are not saved by moments. They are saved by what comes after. What came after was Abdulaziz, inheritor of the dream and architect of its first betrayal, a sultan whose ambition would bleed the provinces dry and leave the throne mortgaged to foreign creditors. After him came Abdulhamid II, the Red Sultan, who would answer the empire's fragility not with reform, but with paranoia, purge, and the iron silence of absolute control. And finally, Mehmed V, the last sultan of this story. Not a tyrant, not a reformer, simply a man left to watch from a throne that history had already emptied of meaning, as the world around him lurched toward the catastrophe that would finish what debt and despotism had started. 3 sultans, 3 failures, one slow and terrible consumption of everything the Tanzimat had built. This is the long betrayal, and it begins with a man born to inherit a dream, who bled it dry.
Abdulaziz was born in 1830, son of Mahmud II, raised in a palace where reform and discipline collided. From childhood, he showed little of the charm or polish of his elder brother Abdulhamid. Instead, he preferred riding, archery, wrestling, and the rougher habits of an outdoorsman. He sketched obsessively birds, ships, and military scenes, but his schooling in languages and literature lagged behind. Where Abdulhamid was groomed to be a reformer, Abdulaziz was molded as a warrior prince. He lived much of his youth in the background, observing his brother's reign but rarely intruding into politics. He envisioned sultanic power not as charters or committees, but as grandeur, discipline, and presence. In the 1850s, he accompanied his brother on ceremonial occasions and state visits, yet remained aloof. Friends and courtiers called him reserved, even dour. He read little, but when he spoke, it was with blunt clarity. In him was a streak of Mahmud II's iron will, but without Mahmud's subtlety. A French visitor described him as taciturn and heavy, yet with the air of a man who watches everything. Ottoman chroniclers noted his strength and austerity, hinting at stubbornness. He had Mahmud II's frame, broad-shouldered and imposing, but his temperament was blunter, quick to anger, quick to forgive. By the time Abdulhamid lay dying in Dolmabahce, Abdulaziz had been waiting in the wings for 2 decades. He had seen Europe's envoys belittle his brother, watched Fuad and Ali Pasha rule in the Sultan's name, and resolved that his reign would not be a performance for others. On June 25, 1861, the empire mourned Abdulhamid, but mourning quickly gave way to coronation. Abdulaziz appeared in public for the first time as Sultan, riding on horseback through the streets of Istanbul. Crowds spilled into the avenues, craning to see the new ruler. Banners fluttered, cannons roared from the shore, and the Meta's drums shook the air. The sword of Osman, the ancient emblem of legitimacy, was bound to his waist, its steel glinting in the summer light. Unlike his frail brother, Abdulaziz sat tall in the saddle, shoulders squared, face stern. To the people, it felt as though the age of Ghazi sultans had returned. An English correspondent described him as a dark, powerful figure, less courtly than Abdulhamid, but far more commanding. The people noticed it too. Here was not the pale, reclusive reformer of the last years, but a man who carried himself like a serdar. The enthronement at Topkapi was steeped in tradition. The ulama recited prayers. The sword of Osman was girded on him, and the Meta band thundered. European ambassadors remarked on his severity. One French observer noted, "The new sultan does not smile for effect. He looks upon men as subjects, not as equals." Istanbul cheered, some out of genuine hope for a strong ruler, others out of relief that the fragile Abdulhamid era had ended. But the empire Abdulaziz inherited was anything but strong. The Tanzimat reforms had modernized the state. Schools, ministries, railways, and telegraphs bound the empire closer together. But the cost was crippling. Foreign loans had ballooned, and already half of some provincial revenues were pledged before collection. European creditors sat like permanent guests in the Sublime Porte, monitoring expenditures and dictating reforms. Corruption festered in the bureaucracy. In the Balkans, whispers of revolt spread. In Crete, open unrest was only a few years away. The Crimean War had saved the empire from Russia, but only by chaining it more tightly to Britain and France. And behind it all, in the shadows, Russia waited. The Crimean War had ended in humiliation for Nicholas I, but Russia had not abandoned its ambitions. The Balkans simmered with Slavic unrest. Orthodox voices looked to St. Petersburg for support, and Russian agents whispered in border towns. Abdulaziz, weary of Britain and France's condescension, wondered if perhaps Russia could be a partner instead of an enemy. It was a dangerous thought. To Britain and France, Russia was the eternal foe, the empire whose ambitions had dragged Europe into the Crimean War. To Abdulaziz, however, Russia offered something the others never did: respect. St. Petersburg might plot and scheme, but it did not lecture, belittle, or dress reform in chains. For the first time in decades, an Ottoman sultan considered turning to the empire's oldest enemy as a possible friend. That thought, tentative at first, would haunt the decade ahead. This was the empire Abdulaziz claimed, polished on the surface, brittle beneath. Diplomats expected another compliant reformer. Instead, they found a man of iron and velvet, autocratic, ambitious, and determined to rule on his own terms. Two great statesmen still towered at his side: Fuad Pasha, the sharp-tongued diplomat, and Ali Pasha, the tireless administrator. Together, they had kept Abdulhamid's reign afloat, but Abdulaziz eyed them warily. To him, they were servants who had grown too powerful, men who spoke with Europe's voice as often as their sultans. He would use them, but never trust them. Already in 1861, Abdulaziz's instincts pulled him toward spectacle: new palaces, a modern army, and above all, a navy to rival the West. He dreamed of grandeur and ironclads as symbols of power, even if the treasury could not bear the cost. His reign would begin with a gamble, one that dazzled the world but hollowed his empire's finances. For now the balance held: a sultan of iron and velvet, and two grand viziers who quietly pulled the empire's strings. But beneath the pomp of coronation, debts whispered, provinces smoldered, and creditors circled like vultures. Abdulaziz dreamed of strength and spectacle, yet every step toward grandeur carried him closer to chains. The stage was set for a navy that would gleam like empire reborn, and a treasury that would bleed it dry. From his earliest sketches as a prince, Abdulaziz had drawn birds and ships, and now as sultan, he turned those boyhood drawings into state policy. The Tanzimat had built schools and ministries, but Abdulaziz dreamed in hulls and iron. Within months of his coronation, contracts poured into British and French shipyards. In Britain, firms like Thames Iron Works and the Samuda brothers launched armoured frigates and turret ships for the Sultan, while in France, the yards at Toulon and Bordeaux hammered out designs to rival Napoleon III's own fleet. Contracts flowed east and west, and Ottoman gold bought not only hulls and guns, but also prestige, the great powers themselves building for the Padishah. By the late 1860s, the Bosphorus was alive with the sight of foreign-built giants steaming beneath the red flag and crescent. The Sultan wanted everything modern: steam-driven engines, rifled cannon, iron armor. By the mid-1860s, the scale was staggering. The empire that a decade earlier had limped through the Crimean War with borrowed ships was now building what foreign observers ranked as the third largest navy in the world.
behind only Britain and France. By 1867, the Ottoman fleet counted more than 21 modern ironclads either under construction or at sea, with nearly 150 steam-powered vessels in total, frigates, corvettes, gunboats, and paddle steamers. The pride of the fleet were the Osmani-class ironclads, Osmani, Aziziye, Orhaniye, and Mahmudiye. These colossal broadside warships armored in Britain could brave Russian batteries in the Black Sea. On paper, the Sultan's navy now rivaled Europe's great fleets. To admirers, it seemed the very image of renewal, proof the empire could still stand shoulder to shoulder with the powers of the age. To skeptics, they were little more than gleaming monuments to debt. To the wider Islamic world, the effect was electrifying, the caliph's fleet reborn, modern and mighty. Abdulaziz toured the dockyards personally, chest thrust forward, striding across half-finished decks, sketching improvements in his own hand. European journalists, so often mocking toward Ottoman backwardness, now wrote with surprise, even awe, at the Sultan's ambition. But Fuad Pasha and Ali Pasha were far less dazzled. For every ironclad they saw, they counted endless lines in the treasury ledger. Fuad warned, a ship is not just steel and steam, but wages, coal, repairs without end. Ali added, we buy glory at a cost we cannot repay. Yet Abdulaziz brushed them aside. Prestige mattered more than arithmetic, and prestige was ruinously expensive. Each ironclad cost hundreds of thousands of pounds sterling, sums the treasury could never truly spare. The empire borrowed to build, then borrowed again to fuel, to crew, to repair. European bankers gladly obliged, offering loans at steep interest, secured against Ottoman customs revenues. Every keel laid in London or Toulon meant another lien upon Ottoman sovereignty. By the late 1860s, half of all foreign debt was tied to naval spending. Ministries went unpaid. Provincial governors remitted taxes directly to European bondholders, yet the fleet still grew. Russia, the supposed target of this naval build-up, watched with calm amusement. In theory, the fleet was built to ensure the Black Sea would never again become a Russian lake. And indeed, the sight of Ottoman ironclads gliding through the Bosphorus unsettled Russian envoys. But the Tsar grasped the deeper truth. The empire could never afford to man, fuel, or maintain such a force. Bankruptcy would scuttle the fleet long before Russian shells ever did. Still, Abdulaziz pressed on. In 1867, he sailed triumphantly to Europe aboard the brand-new Sultaniye, visiting Paris and London, greeted as a modern monarch. Crowds cheered. Napoleon III dined with him. Queen Victoria received him at Windsor. For a fleeting moment, the Ottoman Sultan was no longer the sick man of Europe, but Padishah-i-Bahri, Sultan of the Sea, with an armada behind him, his prestige restored. Yet beneath the glitter, the truth was damning. Sailors went unpaid. Some ironclads never left port for lack of coal. Others sat half-crewed, their engines rusting. The fleet lived more in account books than on the open sea. It was a mirage of strength, purchased on credit. By 1870, the Ottoman navy gleamed on paper as the second-largest ironclad fleet in the world. But the treasury groaned under the weight. Abdulaziz had built his dream. But the cost was staggering. A navy that dazzled foreign courts, yet mortgaged the empire's very future. But just as Abdulaziz paraded his fleet before Europe, another force was reshaping the seas. In 1869, the French completed the Suez Canal, a waterway that linked the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and the wider Indian Ocean. For centuries, Ottoman galleys had guarded the pilgrim routes to Mecca and the trade of the Red Sea. Now a French-dug channel made Egypt the true gateway of the East. To Abdulaziz, the canal was both an opportunity and a humiliation, a lifeline that might expand Ottoman influence, but one dug and controlled by foreign hands. His grand fleet, meant to project independence, would forever steam through a passage ruled by others. The Sultan believed he had matched Europe ship for ship. In truth, he had chained his empire more tightly to European bankers, and no broadside could blast apart the bonds of debt. The fleet was magnificent, but it was also an anchor, pulling the empire down.
Abdulaziz poured money and attention into Istanbul. Dolmabahce was already the jewel of the Bosphorus, but he wanted more. The Chura'an Palace rose in white marble, and Beyla Bey glittered with crystal chandeliers, residences not just for the Sultan, but for visiting monarchs. Istanbul gained new boulevards, ministries and railway lines linking the city to Edirne and beyond. The capital now looked more like Paris on the Bosphorus than the seat of an old Islamic empire. To foreign visitors it was dazzling. To provincial governors it was insulting. Their villages starved while the Sultan built palaces of stone and glass. To the south, Crete had long been a sore point for the Ottomans. When Greece won independence in the 1820s, many Cretans, overwhelmingly Orthodox Christian, expected their island to follow. Instead, Crete was retained by the empire, a prize too strategic to lose, controlling the sea lanes between the Aegean and the eastern Mediterranean. Though promised reforms and leniency, the island remained heavily garrisoned, its people taxed and its Orthodox majority resentful. By the 1860s, it was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The spark came in 1866, when Orthodox leaders, encouraged by Greek sympathizers and a network of revolutionary committees, rose in revolt. For 3 years, the mountains of Crete became a battlefield. Ottoman troops marched through ravines and villages, but the rebels fought a war of ambushes and retreats. The navy, meant to blockade the island, blundered repeatedly. Smugglers and sympathizers slipped through with arms and supplies from Greece. In 1867, even Egyptian troops had to be dispatched to reinforce Ottoman garrisons. Despite brutal repression, the Ottomans never quite sealed the island off, and European sympathy for the rebels swelled after the bloody siege at Arkadi Monastery, where hundreds of Cretan insurgents and civilians died in an explosion rather than surrender. In the end, the rebellion was crushed, but Crete remained inside the Ottoman fold. Still, it was a hollow victory. The revolt left deep scars, and the dream of union with Greece never disappeared. For the empire, Crete became a symbol of the wider problem. Distant provinces held by force, simmering with resentment, waiting for the right moment to rise again. To the north, Bosnia, nestled in the mountains of the Western Balkans, had always been a difficult province to govern. Its population was a patchwork of Muslim landowners, Orthodox peasants, and Catholic minorities, divided by faith but united in hardship when famine struck in the 1860s. The fertile valleys produced grain and livestock, but much of it was siphoned away through taxation and now increasingly through debt repayments to European creditors. When poor harvests came, villages starved. Ottoman officials tried to maintain order, but famine bred unrest. Orthodox villagers whispered that Russia, not Istanbul, would bring relief. Secret societies spread pamphlets and promises, encouraging peasants to see themselves as part of a wider Slavic cause. Russia, moving quietly but deliberately, fanned the embers, offering money, priests, and propaganda. To the Ottomans, Bosnia was still loyal soil. In truth, it was already slipping, its hunger pulling it toward rebellion and foreign influence. Far to the southeast, Arabia strained under Ottoman rule. Tribal confederations clashed with governors over taxes and autonomy. Bedouin raiders disrupted pilgrim routes, and the Hajj, once a symbol of Ottoman legitimacy as caliphs, grew harder to protect. Every revolt, every bandit raid was a reminder that while Istanbul built palaces, its grip on the deserts of the Prophet weakened. Fuad and Ali Pasha knew the danger. They pleaded with the Sultan, reforms must reach the provinces, not just the capital. Without schools, roads, and relief, they warned, the empire would hollow out.
Abdulaziz listened, but his heart remained in Istanbul, where every railway line, every chandelier, every ironclad seemed to prove the empire's greatness. To him, the provinces were distant, ungrateful, and secondary to the image of imperial strength. By the end of the 1860s, the contradiction was plain. In the capital, marble palaces glittered beneath gaslight, and European visitors marveled at Ottoman modernity. In the provinces, revolts flared, villages starved, and tribes slipped further from control. The center gleamed, but the edges burned. Yet while Abdulaziz struggled to hold his empire's provinces together, another drama was unfolding far to the northwest. In Germany, the 1860s saw Otto von Bismarck rise to power, steering Prussia through wars with Denmark and Austria, laying the foundations for unification. Prussian officers who once advised the Ottomans now commanded Europe's most disciplined army. As the Ottoman Empire strained to centralize, Germany was consolidating, and soon the balance of power in Europe would tilt. While Abdulaziz looked anxiously toward Russia, another power was rising in the heart of Europe. The empire's most fateful ally was taking shape, a Prussia whose discipline and ambition would one day bind Ottoman destiny to its own, for better and for worse. Wars. Prussia was not yet Germany, but already Otto von Bismarck was reshaping Europe. In 1864, Prussia and Austria humbled Denmark. In 1866, Prussia defeated Austria at Königgrätz. This rising power, still without colonies or Mediterranean interests, began sending signals east. Prussian engineers surveyed railways, German firms pitched telegraph contracts, and officers came to advise Ottoman counterparts. The Krupp Armaments Works, fast becoming Europe's premier artillery manufacturer, courted Ottoman contracts, offering modern breech-loading cannons at prices lower than British Armstrong guns. Even in shipyards, German firms quietly competed, though British and French yards still dominated Ottoman naval construction. The contrast was not lost on Istanbul, where British consuls scolded and French ambassadors hinted at intervention. Prussia sent technical advisors. Helmuth von Moltke's earlier service in the 1830s as a young officer was still remembered as his mobile army stormed around Europe. A Prussian who had lived with Ottoman soldiers, shared their hardships, and treated them with respect. Now his successors carried the same spirit. They praised Ottoman soldiers as brave, if ill-equipped, and urged reforms without sneering. For Fuad and Ali Pasha, the difference was stark. They had spent years firefighting crises with Britain and France peering over their shoulders. Yet the Prussians treated them as colleagues, not clients. In private conversations, both men admired Prussian discipline and administrative efficiency. They could imagine borrowing that discipline without surrendering sovereignty. Abdulaziz himself was harder to win. He was dazzled by ships and palaces, less by drill books and rail surveys. Yet even he noticed the difference. When Prussian envoys addressed him, they spoke of partnership, not oversight. They sought trade and contracts, not territories or protectorates. And most importantly, unlike Britain, France, and Russia, Prussia had no conflicting ambitions in the Ottoman sphere. No ports, no colonies, no orthodox protections, just respect and a promise of mutual advantage. Meanwhile, in the Balkans, the old vultures circled. Russia pressed its pan-Slavic ambitions, dreaming of protectorates stretching to the Aegean. Austria, humbled in Germany and Italy, turned south after 1867, eyeing Bosnia and Serbia as its new sphere. For the Ottomans, it was a vice. Russia from the east, Austria from the north. Into this squeeze stepped Prussia, a power with no territorial claims in the Balkans, no debts to collect, no navy prowling Ottoman seas. For the first time in decades, a European power appeared not as a predator, but as a partner. Yet beneath that courtesy lay the seed of even more dependency, a friendship that in time would bind the empire's fate to Berlin's ambitions. It was, in hindsight, a subtle but profound shift. While Britain and France strangled the empire with loans, and Russia fanned unrest in the Balkans, Prussia extended a quieter hand. In the 1860s, it was only engineers, Krupp cannons, and courteous envoys, but it planted the seed of something greater, a partnership that would, within a few decades, draw the Ottomans into Germany's orbit. By the end of the decade, Istanbul glittered with palaces and ironclads, but its balance sheet buckled. The empire still staggered under foreign debt, and just as Prussia rose, the last great Ottoman statesmen, Fuad and Ali Pasha, began to fade. Without them, the empire would be left with a sultan more isolated, erratic, and vulnerable than ever. In our next episode, The Panic Years, the guardrails vanish. Fuad Pasha dies in 1869, Ali Pasha in 1871. Corruption spreads, censorship tightens, and Abdulaziz begins to look north, toward Russia, for friendship. The empire lurches into crisis, and the noose of debt begins to tighten. This is Road to Destruction, the World Wars. In our last episode, we watched a quiet but profound shift. As Britain and France scolded and squeezed, Prussia arrived with engineers, contracts, and respect. For a moment, it seemed the Ottomans might have found a new path, a European power that did not demand repayment or territory. But in 1869 and 1871, tragedy struck in Istanbul. Fuad Pasha and then Ali Pasha, the last great statesman of the Tanzimat, died. With them went the last guardrails of reform. The empire they left behind was not yet ruined, but without their skill and discipline, the Ottoman state began to drift into chaos. This is Road to Destruction, the World Wars. As Ali Pasha's coffin was carried out of Istanbul in 1871, another figure edged closer to the center of power, Mahmud Nedim Pasha. To his admirers, he was pliable and charming. To his critics, he was vain, venal, and far too fond of Russian whispers. In the absence of giants like Fuad and Ali, men like Mahmud Nedim thrived. He would become in time the symbol of everything the Tanzimat had once tried to resist: corruption, censorship, and dependence on foreign powers. Abdulaziz, once nudged toward reform by his viziers, now stood alone, and alone he faltered. Instead of reasoned counsel, he was surrounded by flatterers, men like Mahmud Nedim Pasha, whose nickname Nedimov reflected his coziness with Russian envoys. Ministers became courtiers, courtiers became ministers, and policy became indulgence. Ships were ordered without plans, palaces drawn up without revenues, railways promised without budgets. The Sultan ruled not by reform, but by impulse. Abdulaziz, now in his mid-40s, withdrew deeper into his palaces. Once proud to host monarchs and oversee ministries, he now surrounded himself with favorites who told him only what he wished to hear. Where Ali Pasha had once argued, Abdulaziz's new advisers bowed. The Sultan, who had once been coaxed toward reform, now indulged his whims. The Tanzimat had once promised freedom of the press, but in these years, fear triumphed over promise. Istanbul's newspapers, Tercümani Ahval and Tasvir-i Efkar, had grown bolder, printing sharp critiques of waste and corruption. In 1872, Shinasi's successors were harassed into silence. Namık Kemal, the young poet and journalist, was forced into exile for criticizing the Sultan's extravagance. Abdulaziz's answer to dissent was censorship. Presses shuttered, writers banished, and political speech strangled. What had been the empire's first experiment in public accountability collapsed into paranoia. Corruption filled the void. Without Ali Pasha's discipline, ministries became feeding grounds. Telegraph contracts went to friends of the palace. Railway concessions were sold off cheaply to foreign speculators. The Ministry of Public Works, once tasked with modernizing, became notorious for bribes and kickbacks. Provincial governors followed the example.
In Bosnia, food aid during the famine of the 1860s was diverted to profiteers. In Crete, soldiers went unpaid while administrators lined their pockets. The Tanzimat's promise of just, efficient government had curdled into graft. Beyond the capital, the empire's hold on its provinces grew weaker still. In Arabia, the Sharif of Mecca quarreled with Istanbul over subsidies, while Bedouin raids disrupted pilgrim caravans. The prestige of protecting the Hajj, once a pillar of Ottoman legitimacy as caliph, grew harder to maintain. In the Balkans, Orthodox peasants whispered that Russia, not Istanbul, would bring relief. Secret committees spread pamphlets and prayers, fanned by agents from St. Petersburg, and all the while the world moved on. In 1869, the Suez Canal opened, a marvel of engineering that redrew the map of trade. French engineers cut through desert rock, and British ships cut weeks off the voyage to India. Yet for the Ottomans, whose empire straddled the Red Sea, the canal brought no real gain. It was owned and operated by Europeans, another reminder of how modernization happened around them, not through them. Meanwhile, Russia stepped closer. Its diplomats whispered of Orthodox Muslim solidarity, of peace between old enemies. Abdulaziz, tired of British arrogance and French lectures, listened. Even Russia, the empire's oldest foe, now seemed preferable to constant humiliation from the West. By 1873, the Ottoman Empire glittered on the surface, but beneath was hollow, censored, corrupt, and deeply in debt. The Tanzimat dream was dead, and the Sultan was more isolated than ever. The empire was drifting into crisis, its foundations rotting beneath marble palaces and ironclads, and soon those foundations would crumble. By the early 1870s, the Ottoman state was drowning in obligations. Every new palace and battleship had been financed not from tax surpluses, but from loans. At first, these came from the great European banks, the Rothschilds, the Crédit Mobilier of Paris, and the Barings of London. But soon even they grew wary. Interest rates soared. Ottoman borrowing shifted downward into the hands of Galata bankers in Istanbul, who acted as middlemen, slicing up Ottoman debt into smaller parcels and selling it on European markets. The terms were brutal. Revenues from provincial taxes on tobacco, salt, and even customs houses were mortgaged years in advance. In effect, the empire was selling tomorrow's income to survive today. By 1874, over half of all imperial revenues were already pledged to creditors before they reached the treasury. Without Fuad and Ali Pasha, no one remained who could restrain Abdulaziz's extravagance or negotiate firmly with foreign creditors. The ministries rotted. Money intended for infrastructure or schools disappeared into bribes, inflated contracts, or the bottomless maw of the Sultan's prestige projects. Among the courtiers who rose in this atmosphere was Mahmud Nedim Pasha, soon nicknamed Nedimov by his critics for his open closeness with the Russian embassy. Where Fuad and Ali had once stood as barriers between the empire and foreign manipulation, Mahmud Nedim embodied the opposite: flattery, opportunism, and pliancy. He promised the Sultan loyalty and easy solutions while quietly currying favor with St. Petersburg. In the years to come, his mismanagement would help tip the empire over the financial edge, and the prestige projects multiplied. Abdulaziz dreamed of rivaling Paris and London. The navy, once a point of pride, became a fiscal black hole. Ironclads bought from Britain and France at exorbitant cost, many of them rotting at anchor for lack of coal or trained crews. Railroads were begun and abandoned, their bonds sold abroad while the tracks lay unfinished. And all the while, Dolmabahce and Turan palaces devoured more funds, symbols of grandeur paid for with borrowed money. Censorship made it worse. As the empire's finances collapsed, the Sultan tightened the press. Newspapers could not openly question the loans or point out the fraud. Instead, rumor filled the void, whispers of embezzlement, of palace favorites profiting from contracts, of ministries auctioned to the highest bidder. Public trust,
already brittle, snapped. Meanwhile, creditors tightened their grip. When repayments fell short, European embassies pressed harder. Ottoman statesmen could not ignore what had just happened in Egypt. Khedive Ismail, who had sunk vast sums into the Suez Canal, was forced into dependence when his debt spiraled out of control. By the early 1870s, French and British officials had moved into Cairo's ministries, dictating its budget line by line. To Istanbul, this was the nightmare scenario: to lose sovereignty not to armies, but to accountants. And Europe itself was shifting in ways that made Ottoman weakness even more dangerous. In Paris, the fall of Napoleon III after the Franco-Prussian War shattered French confidence. The Crédit Mobilier and other grand Parisian banks, once the engines of overseas finance, were reeling. Investors sought safer returns, and Ottoman bonds no longer looked secure. In Britain, by contrast, financial strength endured. London bankers began pressing for stricter control of Ottoman repayments, seeing themselves as the guardians of international credit. And Austria, humiliated in 1866 and squeezed out of Italy and Germany, turned its gaze south along with Russia. Both countries' officials spoke more openly of the Balkans as their natural sphere, quietly watching for the moment when Ottoman finances would collapse enough to make intervention possible. For the Ottoman Empire, it meant isolation. No Fuad, no Ali, no strong allies abroad, only creditors demanding payment and neighbors waiting for weakness. By the mid-1870s, the system was breaking. More than half the empire's income flowed directly to foreign creditors. Ministries were corrupt, provinces restless, and the Sultan increasingly isolated. And as the treasury bled, another current began to stir: opposition to Abdulaziz himself. The restlessness in the provinces finally spread inwards and into his own palace. Among reformers, intellectuals, and even within the army, whispers spread that the Sultan had led the empire into ruin. In the shadows of government, figures began to circle. Midhat Pasha, once the energetic governor of the Danube, had returned to Istanbul, furious that the empire's debt swallowed the very funds needed for reform. He spoke openly of constitutions and parliaments, his words a direct challenge to Abdulaziz's autocracy. In the army, Hüseyin Avni Pasha, a soldier's general who watched his men go unpaid while palaces rose on the Bosphorus, grew restless under the Sultan's erratic rule. Even within the palace itself, whispers spread. Murad, the Sultan's nephew and heir, was admired by reformers and intellectuals, a prince who might rescue the empire from its slide into bankruptcy and humiliation. These men did not yet conspire together, but their discontent grew from the same poisoned root: Abdulaziz's financial ruin of the empire. By the mid-1870s, their names had become rallying points for discontent, the early fracture lines of the storm that would soon break over the palace. It was not yet revolution, but it was the beginning of a movement that would end with a palace coup and the Sultan's violent death. Now, in October 1875, the math could no longer be hidden, and decades of constant reforms and naval rebuilds and wealth mismanagement had caught up. The Sublime Porte made the announcement investors dreaded. The empire would suspend payments. The half-a-millennia-old Ottoman Empire had defaulted. This is road to destruction, the world wars. The crash was immediate. In Galata, Istanbul's financial district, Jewish and Levantine bankers, families like the Kamondos and Baltazis, who had underwritten Ottoman borrowing for decades, were ruined overnight. In Paris, Crédit Mobilier, already reeling from the fall of Napoleon III in 1871, staggered under the loss. In Vienna, where the Rothschilds had been major backers of Ottoman bonds, panic spread through trading houses. British papers sneered that the Sultan had eaten up the empire and left the bones to Europe. French journalists warned that what had begun in Egypt after the Suez Canal, debt turned into foreign control, was now spreading to Istanbul. And indeed, the creditors struck back. A council of European representatives descended on the capital, demanding guarantees. Even more customs revenues, salt monopolies, and taxes on tobacco were pledged directly to foreign hands. The Galata bankers, once middlemen, now found themselves bypassed. London and Paris wanted control at the source. Though the Ottoman Public Debt Administration would not be formalized until later, the logic was already here in 1875. Sovereignty mortgaged, ministries powerless, foreign inspectors dictating policy from behind a desk. Debt was not just humiliation, it was instability. To extract more revenue, Ottoman tax collectors in Bosnia and Herzegovina pushed villages to breaking point. In July, Orthodox peasants rose in revolt, their cries carried across the border into Serbia and Montenegro. Ammunition and volunteers slipped in from Belgrade and Cetinje, cheered on by pan-Slavic committees. Soon, the rebellion spread into the highlands of Herzegovina, where Ottoman garrisons struggled to contain it. In Bulgaria, churchmen and teachers turned debt into destiny. If the empire could not even pay its soldiers, if it bowed to bankers in Paris, why should Bulgarians obey its governors? Pamphlets declared that the empire is dead, only the Slavs remain. Russia seized the opportunity. Arms flowed across the Danube, Orthodox priests carried messages of revolt, and Russian newspapers framed the uprising as holy struggle. What had begun in Galata's counting houses now burned through the Balkans. Abdulaziz, who once dreamed of ironclads and palaces, now found himself bankrupt, despised, and encircled. Russia thrived on Ottoman weakness. Austria saw Bosnia and Herzegovina as ripe for the taking. Britain, wary after the Suez, wanted control. France, financially crippled after 1871, needed payment. The Sultan, once courted in European palaces, was now treated as a failed debtor, a liability, and in Istanbul the default became political dynamite. Reformers and intellectuals whispered that Abdulaziz had squandered the empire's future. The army, unpaid and resentful, began to look for new leadership. Ministers who had once bowed before the Sultan's will now muttered that the Padishah himself was the greatest obstacle to survival. And in the shadows, names began to circulate, men who would soon move against the throne. Midhat Pasha, still championing reform but impatient with Abdulaziz's mismanagement, calculated every weakness of the Sultan's administration. Hussein Avni Pasha, a senior military officer, bristled at the decayed state of the army and the navy, already hollowed by debt and neglect. Kara Mehmed Rushdie Pasha, skilled in palace politics, read the mood of the ministers and bureaucrats alike, sensing that the Sultan's isolation made him vulnerable. Together they were not yet in open rebellion, but the seeds were planted, a conspiracy of ambition and necessity, quietly coalescing around the financial collapse, the provincial unrest, and a ruler whose grasp on power was slipping like sand through his fingers. The empire's heart trembled, and Istanbul's ministers whispered of a day when the throne itself might be overturned. The Eastern crisis had begun, a financial collapse that lit revolts, drew in empires, and stripped the Sultan of legitimacy. Debt had become conquest. The Ottomans had not been invaded by armies but by contracts, inspectors and creditors, and behind those creditors stood rival powers circling like vultures. For 15 years, Sultan Abdulaziz ruled as a man possessed by visions of grandeur. He dreamed of reviving the empire's majesty with marble palaces and fleets of iron. He wanted to be remembered as the Sultan who restored Ottoman splendor, a naval emperor who would command the seas as Mehmed the Conqueror had once commanded the land. But Abdulaziz was no Mehmed. Where his ancestors conquered, he borrowed. Where they built empires, he built debts. The decay that had set in since the reign of Mahmud II, the swelling bureaucracy, the fractured army, the mortgaged treasury, all reached their breaking point under him. By 1876, the empire was in revolt abroad, bankrupt at home, and rudderless at the center. The year opened in chaos. Bosnia and Herzegovina were aflame. Creditors in Galata pressed harder, demanding payments that no longer existed. Ministries drowning in corruption could not respond to provincial misery. Abdulaziz himself grew erratic, isolated in Dolmabahce, lashing out at critics and surrounding himself with flatterers. The Sultan, who had once toured Europe in splendor, was now mocked in Istanbul as aloof, paranoid, and extravagant. His courtiers whispered, his ministers despaired, and his soldiers grumbled. It was in this atmosphere that the opposition, reformers, ministers, and generals alike began to whisper of action. The architects of that action were three men: Midhat Pasha, the reformer, Hussein Avni Pasha, the soldier, and Kara Mehmet Rushdie Pasha, the statesman. All three had watched the empire stagger under Abdulaziz's rule. They were no revolutionaries. They sought not to overthrow the dynasty, but to save it. And so, in May 1876, they moved. On the 30th, soldiers loyal to them surrounded Dolmabahce Palace. The coup was almost theatrical in its calm. No gunfire echoed, no barricades were raised. Instead, a sultan was simply informed his reign was over. Abdulaziz, stunned, was escorted from the palace where he had lived like a monarch and brought to the Ferrier Palace as a prisoner. In his place, his nephew Murad V was hurriedly placed upon the throne. But Abdulaziz was not a man to accept humiliation quietly. Stripped of his power, confined within the walls of Ferrier, he railed against his captors, demanded his restoration, and swore vengeance. The ministers feared him, for though he was deposed, he was still a son of the dynasty, still beloved by some factions in the army, and still capable of inspiring loyalists to rally. If left alive, he was a danger. If dead, he would become a martyr. And then, on June 4th, 1876, the danger resolved itself, or was resolved. Abdulaziz was found dead in his chamber. His wrists were slit, his blood pooling across the floor. The official story was suicide, a fallen sultan, unable to bear disgrace. But from the first whispers, the story rang false. The cuts were precise, too deep, too clean for a desperate man without aid. The guards claimed to have heard nothing. And the location itself was damning. The very same palace chamber where decades earlier Selim III had been strangled during another palace coup. History had repeated itself, and the shadow of murder was impossible to ignore. Abdulaziz's end remains one of the most haunting mysteries in Ottoman history. The official story was simple. Confined in Ferrier Palace after his deposition, the Sultan asked for scissors to trim his beard, a request his mother allegedly fulfilled, sending him a pair along with a small mirror. Hours later, he was found dead, his wrists slashed. But the details raised more questions than they answered. Why would he ask for scissors under heavy guard? Why not a barber? And why, when his body was examined, did witnesses report bruises and signs of a struggle? To many, it seemed less like the quiet resolve of a fallen monarch and more like the desperate cover-up of a palace killing. Adding to the mystery was testimony from his own daughter, Nazime Sultan, who later claimed she had seen her father's battered body and was convinced he had been murdered. Her words only deepened suspicions that the coup plotters, Midhat Pasha, Hussein Avni Pasha, and their allies had not been willing to risk leaving Abdulaziz alive. Their fears were not unfounded. Murad V, the new sultan they had enthroned, was already showing alarming instability, teetering on the edge of collapse. In such a climate, a counter-coup to restore Abdulaziz was more than a distant threat. It was a real possibility. To many Ottomans, and to Europe watching from afar, the Sultan's bloody end looked less like suicide and more like an execution disguised in ritual. In the coffee houses of Istanbul, people muttered that the Pashas had silenced him. Diplomats in Europe speculated the same. Even within the palace walls, rumors swirled that the ministers feared his return so much they had ordered his death.
Suicide or assassination, the truth was buried with him. No verdict was ever reached. The mystery of Abdulaziz's death remains one of the great unanswered questions of Ottoman history. His fall and death marked more than the end of a reign. They marked the collapse of an illusion. Abdulaziz had tried to summon back the grandeur of empire with palaces and warships, but in the end, his empire was left weaker, poorer, and more divided than ever before. His tragedy was not only personal, but civilizational. He embodied an empire that still dreamed of glory while it bled itself dry. He was, in every sense, the wrong sultan at the wrong moment. And yet, in his death, the stage was set for another. Among those watching quietly in the shadows was a man who had studied, waited, and learned, Abdulhamid II. He would not rule with extravagance, but with fear. He would not dazzle Europe with pageantry, but confound it with paranoia. His reign would last 3 decades, shaping the empire's fate through manipulation, repression, and survival. The frivolous sultan was gone. The cautious one was about to begin. Murad V lasted only 3 months. Already fragile in mind, the shock of Abdulaziz's bloody death shattered him. In his palace he raved and wept, unable to sign documents, unable to stand before his people. Tales spread of him standing in pools for hours, whispering to himself, terrified that assassins were waiting in the shadows. The empire, still smouldering from debt, rebellion, and Balkan unrest, could not endure a madman on the throne. And so, in August 1876, a quiet, overlooked prince was called forward. Abdulhamid, the 34-year-old son of Abdulhamid, raised in obscurity, was suddenly to become the master of an empire on the edge of ruin. His education, his silences, and the horrors he had witnessed would shape not a reformer, not a dreamer, but a survivor. This is Road to Destruction, the World Wars. Born in 1842, Abdulhamid lost his mother young. He was raised instead by Perestu Kardin, who also fostered his cousin Murad. Where Murad was emotional, outgoing, and unstable, Abdulhamid grew withdrawn, cautious, and deliberate. Unlike many princes, including Abdulaziz, Abdulhamid applied himself to study. Tutors schooled him in French literature, geography, and Western sciences. He read voraciously, studied music, and absorbed the Tanzimat ideals that swirled in the palace corridors. But he also learned the quieter lessons of court life through stories of Selim III and the fratricide laws of Mehmed the Conqueror. Power slipped easily from those who flaunted it. Appearances mattered more than ideals, and the knives of those closest to you could be more dangerous than the great armies of foreign powers. In 1867, Abdulhamid joined Abdulaziz on his famous tour of Europe, the first Ottoman sultan to travel west. Together they paraded through Paris, London, and Vienna, marveling at palaces, parliaments, and railways. Crowds cheered, orchestras played, and queens extended their hands. But behind the pageantry, Abdulhamid noticed something else. Europe treated Abdulaziz with contempt. Diplomats whispered about Ottoman debts, mocking the empire as the sick man. Abdulhamid returned to Istanbul with a double-edged impression. Europe's modern achievements were dazzling, but its appetite for Ottoman weakness and control was insatiable. When Abdulaziz was deposed, Murad was thrust onto the throne unprepared. Abdulhamid had already seen his cousin's fragility during their upbringing. Murad was charming, cultured, but quick to tears and overwhelmed by responsibility. The horror of Abdulaziz's death broke him completely. Witnesses described Murad as trembling, incoherent, sometimes weeping for hours. The infamous pool story spread, that he stood waist-deep for hours in the water of Turan Palace, muttering in despair. For 3 months, the empire had no ruler in truth.
Abdulhamid learned a lasting lesson. Madness was weakness, and weakness was fatal with the vultures of Europe circling and ambitious men even closer to home. The death of Abdulaziz haunted Abdulhamid, Murad V, and all of Istanbul. Officially, it was suicide. The fallen sultan had slit his wrists with a pair of scissors sent by his mother, or perhaps used to trim his beard. His daughter testified she saw his body bloodied, bruised and beaten. Others whispered that he was strangled. All in the same room Selim III had been killed. A trial was convened, but its outcome satisfied no one. Ministers accused of murder were acquitted. Testimonies conflicted, some describing Abdulaziz struggling as men held him down, others swearing he died by his own hand. Apocryphal confessions even circulated, describing veins cut with pocket knives. Nothing was proven, everything was possible. For Abdulhamid, the lesson was terrifyingly simple. Selim III had been murdered. Now Abdulaziz too was dead by his own men. No sultan was safe. No ruler could trust his servants. Paranoia became not just instinct but survival. Within a month of Murad V taking the throne, Istanbul was shaken by an act of vengeance that splashed blood across the corridors of power. Cherkes Hasan, a young Circassian officer and brother-in-law of the late Sultan Abdulaziz, stormed into a ministerial meeting with a pistol and dagger. Convinced that the coup-makers had murdered his brother-in-law, Hasan struck with fury. He shot dead Hussein Avni Pasha, the powerful minister of war, and stabbed several others before being subdued and executed on the spot. The Cherkes Hasan incident sent shockwaves through the capital, proof that the ghosts of Abdulaziz's downfall were not satisfied with the current narrative on his death. In 1881, 5 years after the coup, the spectre of Abdulaziz returned to Istanbul's courts. Under Abdulhamid's watch, a new trial was convened to re-examine the former sultan's death. Officially, it was meant to silence rumors of foul play. Unofficially, it was a tool of vengeance. Several of the ministers who had orchestrated Abdulaziz's removal, already weakened by years of exile or disgrace, were hauled before the tribunal. Testimonies revisited the bloodied room, the scissors, the disputed cuts on his arms. The verdict was clear: Abdulaziz had not died by his own hand. Though history still debates the truth, the outcome allowed Abdulhamid to brand his uncle a martyr and his uncle's enemies as traitors. In the empire's collective memory, the suicide faded, replaced by a narrative of betrayal and murder, a wound Abdulhamid would never allow to close. For the remaining two plotters, their reckoning came more slowly. Midhat Pasha, once hailed as the architect of reform, soon found himself outmaneuvered by the very constitution he had written. Abdulhamid used its clauses on state security to banish him into exile, a polite death sentence that would end in strangulation at Taif. Kapudan Ahmet Pasha, who had commanded the fleet against Abdulaziz, was stripped of influence and sent into quiet obscurity. Through law and decree, Abdulhamid made clear what Cherkes Hasan had shown in blood. Those who unseated Abdulaziz would not live to enjoy their victory. Abdulhamid had seen even before the financial collapse of 1875 that the empire's lifeblood flowed to European creditors. More than half the treasury's income was pledged abroad. Britain, France, and Austria demanded reforms and loans in exchange for patience. Russia, meanwhile, stirred the Balkans, feeding rebellion among Orthodox Christians in Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Bulgaria. Abdulhamid saw the empire stagger under the twin pressures of debt and revolt. Already in 1876, before the Public Debt Administration was even born, Europe held the empire in its grip. He understood. The Ottoman throne was not just fragile from within, but encircled from without. When Murad finally broke beyond repair, the ministers turned to Abdulhamid.
In August 1876, he was crowned sultan. After seeing what had happened to Abdulaziz and, in recent memory, Selim III, he entered the throne not with dreams, but with dread and paranoia. Abdulhamid's accession was marked not by a gilded procession, but by a solitary walk. Rejecting tradition, he left the palace on foot, weaving through the streets to Ayub Sultan Mosque, where the centuries-old coronation rite awaited. The crowds whispered as the future sultan, quiet and solemn, approached, girded by neither fanfare nor entourage. At Ayub, the sword of Osman was placed in his hands, a relic of Mehmed the Conqueror, a symbol of legitimacy, and a mantle of centuries of expectation. To onlookers, the gesture suggested humility and piety. To Abdulhamid, it was a calculated display of strength, a signal that he alone would bear the burdens of an empire in crisis. Yet beneath the ceremonial calm, anxiety lingered. The treasury was bleeding, Russian eyes watched, and rumors of Abdulaziz's murder still darkened the palace. His solitary walk was less a triumph than a measured step into a perilous inheritance, a silent acknowledgement of the fear and vigilance that would define his reign. For Murad V, there was no fake suicide. He was confined to Chiran Palace under house arrest for the remainder of his life, a living testament to the dangers of perceived instability at the heart of the empire. The empire expected renewal. Instead, it received a ruler whose first and deepest instinct was survival through the removal of any threat. The Blood Sultan would go on to build schools, railways, and propaganda networks, but at his core was the quiet boy who had seen too much. He carried a revolver in his pocket, fearing assassins. He ordered soldiers to drill with unloaded rifles, terrified that an armed garrison might turn against him. He studied the palace walls where Selim III and Abdulaziz had died, and swore it would not be his fate. When Abdulhamid took the throne in 1876, the air still stank of blood and betrayal. His cousin was insane, his uncle was dead, and all around him he sensed his ministers whispered of reform while plotting their own survival. Abroad, the Balkans burned, and Russia's shadow loomed larger with each passing day. Now, in the autumn of 1876, the empire turned to its new sultan for hope. The treasury was bankrupt. The Balkan provinces were in open revolt. Russian armies massed beyond the Danube, waiting for their moment, and in Istanbul, European vultures circled, while ministers whispered that only reform could save the state. At their head stood Midhat Pasha, a name already familiar to us. He had been a reformer under Abdulaziz, a governor in the Balkans, and a man celebrated in Europe as the architect of progress. Alongside him were intellectuals like Namık Kemal, the fiery poet of liberty, and the circle of reformers who called themselves the Young Ottomans. To them, Abdulhamid was a blank slate, a quiet, overlooked prince who might be convinced to lead a new era. Their solution was radical, a constitution. For centuries, the Sultan's power had been absolute, checked only by palace intrigue and the mutiny of soldiers. Now, for the first time, a written charter would define the rights of the people and the limits of the throne. The timing was no accident. The empire had defaulted on its debts in 1875, and the creditor powers, Britain, France, Austria, demanded reform in exchange for patience. They wanted the Balkans pacified, minorities protected, and their loans repaid. A constitution, they argued, would show the world that the Ottoman Empire was becoming civilized, a partner worth saving, albeit one under control. And so, in December 1876, under Abdulhamid's watch, the first Ottoman constitution was proclaimed. A parliament was summoned in Istanbul. Deputies arrived from every corner of the empire: Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, Kurds. Some came in ornate kaftans, others in the modern fez and frock coat. Their speeches filled the chamber with new words: liberty, equality, representation. Newspapers, briefly freed from censorship, heralded the dawn of a new age. But Abdulhamid was no liberal. He had studied Europe on Abdulaziz's grand tour of 1867. He had seen the parliaments of London and Vienna, the boulevards of Paris, the applause of the crowds. And he had seen the contempt behind their smiles, the whispers about Ottoman debts, the mockery of the sick man of Europe. To Abdulhamid, a parliament was not a symbol of strength. It was a stage for betrayal. So he played his part carefully. He allowed the constitution, smiled for Europe, and sat for portraits as a reformist monarch with his grip firmly on that sword. But in the text of the document, he secured escape clauses: the right to dissolve parliament, the power to exile ministers for state security. It was, from the beginning, a trap. The first months of parliament proved his instincts right. Deputies squabbled over language and privilege. Arab representatives complained of Turkish dominance. Armenians petitioned for reforms in Anatolia. To Abdulhamid, these were not petitions but veiled threats, the same Christian voices Europe always used to weaken the empire from within. Greeks argued over church rights. Every session seemed to confirm what Abdulhamid already believed. Liberty was another word for disunity. To him, the chamber was not a forum of progress, but an echo of his father Abdulmejid's Tanzimat, fine words that had left the empire weak and indebted. And behind it all, Midhat Pasha loomed. To Europe, he was the hero of the moment, the architect of constitutional government. To Abdulhamid, he was a dangerous rival, a man who had already deposed one sultan and might yet depose another. The ministers who had brought down Abdulaziz still haunted the palace. Some were dead: Hussein Avni Pasha shot by Cherkes Hassan, others disgraced or exiled. But Midhat remained, powerful, popular, and ambitious. For Abdulhamid, the lesson was clear. Reform was not salvation. Reform was a weapon in the hands of his enemies. Still, for a brief season, the illusion was dazzling. Crowds in Istanbul cheered the new parliament. European newspapers praised the Sultan as a modernizer. Even in the provinces, there was cautious hope that the empire might find renewal in law. But in Yildiz Palace, Abdulhamid waited, revolver by his side, sword within reach, knowing illusions never last. In early 1878, as war with Russia loomed, he made his move. Parliament was noisy, ineffective, and powerless in the face of invasion. Abdulhamid declared that extraordinary times required extraordinary authority. The constitution was suspended. The parliament was dissolved. Midhat Pasha was summoned to the palace. There he was handed a decree of exile, signed by the very sultan whose throne he had secured. Within days, he was on a ship to Europe, disgraced and powerless. Years later, he would be lured back, tried for treason, and strangled in a prison cell at Taif. For Abdulhamid, it was the perfect ending, the man who had once dreamed of liberty reduced to a corpse in the desert. The Ottoman Constitution of 1876 had lasted barely 2 years, but its ghost lingered. For liberals, it was proof that freedom had been strangled in its cradle. For Abdulhamid, it was confirmation that survival required suspicion. His reign would be marked not by liberty, but by fear. Fear of Europe, fear of reform, fear of his own ministers. The empire's brief experiment with liberty was over. Abdulhamid ruled alone, and alone he would face the greatest trial of his reign: war with Russia. Russian armies massed across the Danube, eager to claim the Balkans for orthodoxy. Soon they would cross the frontier, villages would burn, refugees would flood Anatolia, and the empire would be forced to its knees at San Stefano.
In late 1876, as Abdulhamid tightened his grip, the Constantinople Conference opened. Britain, France, Austria, and Russia demanded reforms for the empire's Christian subjects. Bosnia, Herzegovina and Bulgaria were to receive autonomy, European oversight and foreign guarantees. To Abdulhamid, it was nothing less than dismemberment under another name. He refused. For the first time in a long time, the Ottomans had defied Europe openly, and Europe walked away. This is road to destruction, the world wars. Unbeknownst to him, the empire's fate was already being sealed in secret. That same year, Russia and Austria met at Reichstadt. There, the two empires divided Ottoman lands on paper before the war had even begun. Russia would dominate Bulgaria. Austria would take Bosnia. The Ottoman Empire, still alive on maps, was being carved in advance by foreign hands. Abdulhamid suspected betrayal, but even he could not have imagined how far it had already gone. By April 1877, Russia declared war. Its armies crossed the Danube, answering the call of Balkan Christians in revolt. Serbia and Montenegro joined the struggle. Bulgaria rose in rebellion. The Ottoman Empire, already bankrupt and divided, was dragged into a war it could not afford. At first, there was hope. In the fortress town of Plevna, General Osman Pasha led a defense that stunned Europe. With trenches, redoubts, and disciplined fire, his men repelled wave after wave of Russian assaults. Reports of his heroism raced across the continent. In Vienna and London, newspapers praised the Lion of Plevna, marveling that the sick man of Europe still had claws. But claws cannot stop an avalanche. By December 1877, Osman was surrounded. Starving, his troops sick and exhausted, he attempted a breakout. Wounded and captured, he was honored even by his Russian foes. Yet his defeat marked the collapse of Ottoman resistance in Europe. The way to Constantinople lay open. As the armies clashed, civilians suffered. In Bulgaria, Ottoman irregulars, the Bashi Bazouks, committed atrocities against Christian villagers. Whole communities were massacred. Europe's press erupted with outrage. William Gladstone in Britain denounced the Bulgarian horrors, declaring that the Ottomans had forfeited their place among nations. Once again, the empire's image abroad was not of reform or heroism, but of blood and butchery. Meanwhile, Muslim refugees poured into Anatolia. Families fled burning villages in the Balkans, streaming toward Istanbul with little more than the clothes on their backs. Disease followed them, as did hunger. Anatolian towns buckled under the strain. The empire, already bankrupt, now faced a humanitarian disaster it could not control. For Abdulhamid, the crisis confirmed a new truth. Only Islam could hold his fractured empire together. He began to speak less as sultan and more as caliph, protector of all Muslims, from the Danube to the deserts of Arabia. On the battlefield, disaster piled upon disaster. In January 1878, Russian troops stormed through the Balkans, advancing to the outskirts of Adrianople. The Ottoman capital itself seemed doomed. Only the desperate diplomacy of the Sublime Porte secured an armistice before Russian soldiers could march through Istanbul's gates. But peace came at a price. In March 1878, the Treaty of San Stefano was signed. It was a catastrophe. Bulgaria was granted vast autonomy, stretching from the Black Sea to the Aegean, a greater Bulgaria under Russian influence. Serbia, Romania, and Montenegro won independence. Bosnia was promised reforms that opened the door to Austrian occupation. The Ottoman map, already shrinking for decades, now looked like it might disappear altogether. And in the capital, Abdulhamid drew his lesson. Europe had watched him bleed and done nothing. Britain and France, once patrons of the empire, had stood aside while Russia carved away its lands. Worse, the voices of reform had carried the demands of Christians in the Balkans and Anatolia, and when war came, those same Christians had risen in revolt, stabbing the empire in the back. Liberals had promised that reform would bring salvation, but liberty had brought only division. Midhat Pasha was gone, the constitution strangled in its crib. Now Abdulhamid knew. Only vigilance, only suspicion, only the iron hand of a single ruler could save the state. The Sultan emerged from the war shaken but hardened. The constitution would not return. Parliament would not be summoned. The empire's brief experiment with liberty had ended in fire and blood. But Abdulhamid was not finished. For the moment, Russia's triumph threatened to erase the empire from the map. Yet in Berlin, the balance of Europe would shift again. The great powers would gather, led by Otto von Bismarck, to redraw the frontiers of the Balkans. Bulgaria would be cut down, Russia forced to retreat. The empire would be saved, but at a terrible price. A price that Britain, France and Austria were happy to make them pay.
The Treaty of San Stefano, signed in March 1878, was nothing less than catastrophic. Bulgaria became an autonomous principality under Russian control, stretching like a dagger across the Balkans. Serbia, Romania and Montenegro were recognized as independent states. Bosnia was promised reforms. Russian influence seemed to dominate the entire peninsula. For the Ottomans, it was a humiliation deeper than any battlefield defeat. Half the Balkans lost in a single pen stroke. But the map drawn at San Stefano was too bold for Europe to accept. Britain, in particular, saw a Greater Bulgaria as a Russian puppet on the road to Constantinople, and beyond it, the jewel of India. The Straits and the Suez, two arteries of empire, could not be allowed to fall into Russian hands. And so, in a gesture both dramatic and cynical, the British fleet sailed into the Sea of Marmara. Abdulhamid watched as the Union Jack appeared on the horizon. London declared it was there to protect the empire, but protection came at a price. That price was Cyprus. In June 1878, under the Cyprus Convention, the Sultan agreed to cede the island to Britain as a naval base. It was a bitter bargain. Cyprus would be a fortress for Britain's empire, a staging point to guard the Suez Canal, and to remind the Ottomans of their dependence. Meanwhile, the other powers clamored for their share. Austria-Hungary, jealous of Russian expansion, struck its own deal. It would occupy and administer Bosnia-Herzegovina. France, waiting its turn, would soon seize Tunisia in 1881. Step by step, the empire was being nibbled apart by vultures. To resolve the crisis, Germany's Chancellor Otto von Bismarck summoned the powers of Europe to Berlin. He called himself the honest broker, but the empire was not invited as an equal partner. It was the patient on the table, while the doctors argued over how much of the body could be cut away without killing it. The Congress of Berlin, meeting through June and July 1878, rewrote San Stefano, but not to save the Ottomans. Bulgaria was reduced, split into 3 parts, but still lost to Ottoman control. Bosnia went to Austria. Britain kept Cyprus. France's claims to Tunisia were winked at. In theory, the Ottoman Empire had been saved. In practice, it had survived only because Europe wanted more. Abdulhamid understood the message all too well. His armies had not preserved the empire. His constitution had not impressed Europe. His throne was spared only because Britain feared Russia more than it despised the Ottomans. He would later tell confidants that the empire's survival was no longer in Allah's hands, nor the Sultan's, but in the hands of the great powers, who would decide when the patient lived or died. And within a few years, Britain proved the point. In 1882, riots in Egypt gave London the excuse it had been waiting for. British troops landed, crushed resistance, and occupied the Nile Valley. Officially, the Sultan remained Caliph of Egypt. In reality, the Khedive ruled under British bayonets. The canal that Abdulaziz had once celebrated as a path to prosperity was now a British highway to India. The empire had lost its greatest prize without even firing a shot. For Abdulhamid, Berlin was the ultimate humiliation. He had entered the throne with fear in his heart, and now the lesson was carved into the map itself. The empire would live only so long as the powers of Europe permitted it. For Abdulhamid, the message was clear. If it wasn't daggers at home, it was the knives of Europe carving from afar. Nowhere was safe, not the palace, not the provinces, not even the map itself.
After Berlin, Abdulhamid withdrew, and he was not alone in his fears.
Across Europe, monarchs whispered of daggers and bombs. Revolutionaries stalked the streets of Paris, St. Petersburg, and Vienna. If Europe's emperors were not safe, how could the sultan of a crumbling empire be? He abandoned the old palaces of the Bosphorus and made Yıldız Palace his fortress. Behind its high walls, he created a world of shadows. Audiences with the sultan were rare. Courtiers trembled, ministers plotted, but all knew the sultan's eyes were everywhere. That was no metaphor. Abdulhamid built one of the most extensive intelligence networks of the 19th century, the Hafiye Teşkilatı, the secret police. Every coffeehouse, every mosque, every newspaper had ears. Reports flowed daily to Yıldız, thousands of pages filled with whispers of disloyalty, rumors of sedition, even gossip from the bazaars. At its head stood men like Shakir Pasha, who oversaw the flow of intelligence, and Fehim Pasha, a name whispered in fear, notorious for turning suspicion into exile and exile into death. To the people of Istanbul, the Hafiye were not shadows. They had faces, and they were everywhere. And suspicion meant exile, or worse. The most famous victim was Midhat Pasha, once hailed as the father of the constitution. First banished to Europe, then sent to the distant fortress of Taif, he was strangled in his cell in 1884, a final vengeance for Abdulaziz's death and a warning to all reformers. Namık Kemal, the fiery poet of liberty, was packed off to Cyprus, where he wrote under guard until his death. Radical journalist Ali Suavi attempted to storm Turan Palace in 1878 to free Murad V. He was killed on the spot, his blood on the stones a lesson for all who dreamed of change. Each disappearance, each sudden death reinforced the same message. The Sultan was listening, and the Sultan struck first. Yet Abdulhamid did not rule by fear alone. He rebuilt the empire with schools and railways. Mektebi Mulkiye trained civil servants for a modern bureaucracy. Mektebi Tubiye expanded as a medical school, producing doctors for the army and provinces. Mektebi Harbiye, the military academy, was reorganized with German instructors. Young officers drilled in Prussian discipline, their minds sharpened for war. Dozens of new idadi, secondary schools, rose across Anatolia. For the first time, children in distant provinces learned mathematics, geography, and foreign languages under a centralized Ottoman curriculum. But education was also control. Textbooks praised the Sultan, censored history, and framed loyalty as the highest virtue. The empire was modernizing, but on Abdulhamid's terms, not to create citizens, but subjects. Railways too were laid across Anatolia and the Balkans, but they were not lifelines of commerce. They were arteries of control, designed to move troops swiftly, to crush revolts, to remind distant provinces that the Sultan's hand could reach them. Farmers still hauled their grain by cart, soldiers traveled by train. And to bind the empire spiritually, Abdulhamid revived the title of Caliph. Previous sultans had worn it lightly. Abdulhamid wielded it as a weapon. He sent envoys to India, to North Africa, to Central Asia, proclaiming himself protector of all Muslims against Christian empires. Pamphlets, sermons, and proclamations cast him as the shadow of Allah on earth, a bulwark for the faithful. But if Islam united abroad, it divided at home. Christian subjects, Armenians, Greeks, Assyrians, were now painted, subtly at first, then more openly, as potential traitors. If Europe used Christians as pretexts for intervention, Abdulhamid would brand them as fifth columns. Pan-Islamism was both shield and sword, and soon it would be stained with blood. Abroad, the Sultan's alliances shifted. Britain and France demanded reform, then carved away Egypt and Tunisia. Austria sat astride Bosnia, administering it in a humiliating limbo, Ottoman in name, Habsburg in practice. Encircled, Abdulhamid turned to Germany. Bismarck had hosted Berlin, rewarding his friends Austria and Russia, but Germany did not join in the feast. Instead, it courted the Sultan, railways, military advisors, and sympathetic words. In 1883, the German general Colmar von der Goltz, Goltz Pasha, arrived to modernize the Ottoman army. For Abdulhamid, who trusted no one, Germany seemed a friend, or at least an alternative to the predators of London and Paris. Yet the reality remained hollow. Schools trained students, but also radicalized them. Railways carried soldiers, but not prosperity. Pan-Islamism impressed abroad, but deepened suspicion at home. Abdulhamid had built a new empire of surveillance, loyalty, and religion, but beneath the facade, it was brittle. The newspapers whispered a name that would outlast all his reforms: the Red Sultan.
The Armenian question began not in rebellion, but in broken promises. At the Congress of Berlin in 1878, Europe forced the Sultan to pledge reforms for his Armenian subjects in Anatolia: fair taxation, protection from abuses, equality under law. The ink was hardly dry before the promises were shelved. No gendarmerie arrived to protect Armenian villages from bandits. No officials were punished for extortion. Nothing changed. Armenians also remembered the Constitution of 1876, a document that had briefly promised equality before Abdulhamid strangled it in its crib. To them, the words of reform still echoed. To Abdulhamid, they were nothing but Europe's weapon, written in Armenian blood. By the 1880s, frustration gave way to radicalism. In Geneva, a group of Armenian students founded the Hunchakian Revolutionary Party in 1887. They printed pamphlets calling for reform and smuggled them back into the empire. 3 years later, in Tiflis, another group emerged, the Dashnak Sutyun, or Dashnaks, more militant and better organized. Both groups sent activists across the porous borders of the Caucasus, stirring protest, demanding justice. The Hafiye Teşkilatı, Abdulhamid's secret police, tracked them relentlessly. Informants infiltrated Armenian communities, spies intercepted letters, and dissidents were marked for exile. Reports of Armenian conspiracies filled the Sultan's desk each morning, reinforcing his belief that every petition was treason in disguise. To Abdulhamid, the Hunchaks and Dashnaks were not students or idealists, but assassins in waiting, proof that Europe's promises had already poisoned his subjects. And Abdulhamid had reason to think so. Across Europe, anarchists and radicals struck down kings and queens, ministers and monarchs. Tsar Alexander II blown apart in St. Petersburg, Empress Elizabeth stabbed in Geneva, rulers felled one by one. If emperors in Vienna and St. Petersburg could fall, why not Istanbul? To Abdulhamid, the line between student and assassin was dangerously thin, and he would treat them all as conspirators. Abdulhamid responded not with concession, but with the sword. In 1891, he created the Hamidiye regiments, Kurdish tribal cavalry armed and paid by the state. Officially, they were to guard the eastern frontiers against Russian influence. In reality, they became a weapon against Armenians. Settled disputes turned bloody, land was seized, and whole villages lived in terror of horsemen riding under the Sultan's banner. Tension boiled over in 1894. In the district of Sassoon, Armenians resisted new taxes and abuses by local officials. Their protests were small, scattered, desperate. But Abdulhamid saw rebellion. Troops and Hamidiye units descended. Villages were burned, men cut down, women and children massacred. When the smoke cleared, thousands lay dead. Europe recoiled. British and French newspapers carried lurid accounts from missionaries and diplomats. Pressure mounted for investigation. Abdulhamid agreed, and then doubled down. In 1895, as Armenian protests spread to cities like Istanbul and Erzurum, state-sanctioned mobs were unleashed. What began as crackdowns turned into pogroms. Homes were looted, churches torched, streets ran with blood. The massacres continued through 1896, wave after wave. The death toll was staggering. Conservative estimates put the number at 100,000. Others doubled it. Entire provinces were scarred. Survivors fled to Russia, to Persia, to Europe, carrying with them tales of horror that branded Abdulhamid forever as the Red Sultan. And yet within the empire, Many Muslims hailed him as a defender. To conservatives, the Sultan had acted as caliph, striking down separatists and proving that Islam would not bow to Christian demands. Abdulhamid's image as protector of the faithful was strengthened, even as his legitimacy in Europe bled away. But the cost was immense. The dream of Ottomanism, of a single identity uniting Turk, Arab, Armenian, Greek and Kurd, was dead. The constitution had failed. Reform had failed. Now, blood had taken their place. The empire no longer bound its peoples with promises, but with fear. The Armenian revolutionary parties survived, though battered. Their leaders swore revenge, and their survivors scattered into exile, where they found sympathetic ears among Europe's radicals. For Abdulhamid, the massacres preserved the state in the short term, but they also ensured that Armenians would forever look to Europe, not Istanbul, for salvation. In the West, caricatures of Abdulhamid circulated, a blood-soaked tyrant, a butcher on the Bosphorus. In the East, he was cheered in mosques as caliph. Between the two images lay the truth, a ruler who had chosen survival through repression, even if it left his empire hollow. And for Armenians, the fire and blood of the 1890s was only the beginning, a shadow that would fall darker still when the empire marched to war 2 decades later. By the 1890s, the Ottoman Empire seemed frozen under Abdulhamid's gaze. The constitution was dead, parliament silenced, the press gagged, students drilled in classrooms watched by police spies. Yet beneath the surface, discontent boiled. Intellectuals fled to Paris, London, and Geneva, where they printed newspapers and manifestos that smuggled their way back into Istanbul. In smoky cafes on the Boulevard Saint-Germain, exiled Ottomans dreamed of revolution. They called themselves the Young Turks. At first, the name was loose, a label for students, writers, and exiles demanding a return to the Constitution of 1876. But over time, it hardened into a movement. At its heart was the Committee of Union and Progress, or the Ittihad ve Terakki Cemiyeti, founded in 1889 when 4 medical students, Ibrahim Temo, Abdullah Cevdet, Ishak Sukuti, and Mehmed Reshid, swore an oath to remake the empire. What began in a dormitory spread to the Masonic lodges of Salonika, where Jewish, Greek, and Turkish members alike provided cover for conspiracy. Soon, military garrisons in Macedonia swore oaths by candlelight, pledging their lives to liberty. The paradox was inescapable. The very schools Abdulhamid built to strengthen the empire became breeding grounds for dissent. Young officers drilled with wooden rifles while Russia, Britain, and Greece armed to the teeth. They read European journals while their own newspapers were censored. They learned the language of nationalism and liberty, while at home every word was suspect. And the railways Abdulhamid laid, meant to carry soldiers and supplies, now carried books, pamphlets, and subversive ideas from Paris to Salonika to Istanbul. The empire's lifelines had become arteries of rebellion. From Paris, Ahmed Riza, a positivist inspired by Auguste Comte, spread the Cup's doctrine of progress and order. Others, like Prince Sabahaddin, preached liberalism and decentralization. Their manifestos clashed, but all agreed on one thing: Abdulhamid's rule was a dead end. And in exile, their voices were amplified by Europe, where every Ottoman dissident found a willing press eager to undermine the Sultan. Inside the empire, the underground grew. Secret lodges in Salonika and Monastir, cities teeming with soldiers, Jews, Greeks, Armenians, and Turks, became centers of conspiracy. Students circulated banned journals under their desks. Officers passed pamphlets between barracks. Abdulhamid's police uncovered plot after plot, but the repression was its own poison. Every arrest bred more conspirators. Every exile was a lesson in resistance. Every execution turned rebels into martyrs. Abdulhamid thought he was crushing dissent, but he was multiplying it. No wonder Ahmed Riza in Paris joked, Abdulhamid is the best recruiter for the Committee of Union and Progress. And Abdulhamid had reason to fear. Across Europe, anarchists and radicals struck down kings and queens, ministers and monarchs. Tsar Alexander II blown apart in St. Petersburg, Empress Elizabeth stabbed in Geneva, King Umberto of Italy gunned down in Monza. If emperors in Vienna and St. Petersburg could fall, why not Istanbul? To Abdulhamid, the line between student and assassin was dangerously thin, and he would treat them all as conspirators. The opposition was not united. Some dreamed of restoring the constitution and parliament. Others wanted a new Ottoman nationalism built on Turkish identity. Still others hoped for decentralization, giving Arabs, Kurds, and Armenians autonomy within the empire. But what bound them together was a shared enemy, Abdulhamid. By the early 1900s, Abdulhamid's empire was a paradox. Outwardly, it still stood. Railways stretched across Anatolia, the Hijaz Railway neared completion, palaces gleamed in Istanbul. But inside, the state was hollow. The schools produced rebels, the army plotted in secret, and the very word liberty, hurriyet, became a whispered prayer in the barracks. Mahmud II had broken the Janissaries to save the state. The Tanzimat had promised strength through reform, but each cut, each concession, each imitation of Europe had left the empire weaker. Now, the sons of Abdulhamid's own schools were preparing to finish the work, to topple the Sultan himself. Reform had not saved the empire, it had created its gravediggers.
Centuries, the Ottoman navy had been the empire's pride. From the conquest of Constantinople to the wars against Venice and Spain, its galleys once ruled the Mediterranean. Even in the age of steam, Abdulaziz had dreamed of revival, buying ironclads from Europe, parading the empire's fleet before astonished crowds in London. But by the time Abdulhamid took the throne, those ships lay rusting at anchor in the Golden Horn. It was not the first humiliation. In 1827, the fleet was annihilated at Navarino by Britain, France, and Russia. In 1839, during the Second Egyptian War, an entire squadron defected to Mehmed Ali. And in the 1860s, Abdulaziz spent lavishly on a modern armada, 30 ironclads, making the Ottoman navy briefly the third largest in the world. But it was a fleet of illusions, magnificent on paper yet bankrupting the treasury. New ships arrived, but there was no money for coal, no sailors to crew them. By 1876, the empire had the skeleton of a great fleet, and no means to use it. The irony was bitter. Only a generation earlier, in the Crimean War, Britain and France had forced Russia to scuttle its Black Sea fleet and abandon its ports. The Black Sea had been neutralized, a lake without warships. But after Russia's victory in 1877, those shackles were broken. Sevastopol bristled again with new battleships, while Ottoman vessels lay rotting in the Golden Horn. The balance of the sea had swung, and it was the empire left defenseless. Why? Fear. Abdulhamid trusted the army little, but the navy not at all. He remembered 1876 when Admiral Ahmet Pasha turned the fleet against his uncle Abdulaziz during the coup. A navy that could topple sultans was more dangerous than any Russian squadron, and so Abdulhamid did something unthinkable. He locked his fleet away. For years, Ottoman warships never left the Horn, their crews forbidden from live fire drills, sailors trained with ropes instead of guns while barnacles thickened on the hulls. This mattered because the empire's lifelines were coastal. From the Adriatic to the Aegean, from the Black Sea to the Red Sea, its frontiers touched water more than land. Its trade, its provinces, even its survival depended on the sea. And yet, as rivals armed with steel dreadnoughts, the Ottoman navy sat chained at anchor, a relic guarded more carefully than it was used. The consequences were dire. In the Black Sea, Russia built modern battleships, projecting its power from Sevastopol to the Caucasus. Across the Aegean, Greece expanded its navy, dreaming of a greater Hellas. Britain and France launched steel dreadnoughts,
each new class making the Ottoman fleet look like floating antiques. Abdulhamid tried to compensate on land. He strengthened coastal fortresses at the Dardanelles, trusting stone and cannon over sailors and steel. But he knew the truth. The empire was blind and toothless at sea, and the sailors knew it too. Naval officers, humiliated and sidelined, became some of the most bitter critics of the Sultan. Many drifted into the Young Turk underground, carrying with them the resentment of a navy chained by paranoia. For them, every year in the Horn was proof that Abdulhamid valued his own throne above the empire's survival. Meanwhile, Europe circled. Britain offered modern warships, but at a price the bankrupt empire could not pay. France pushed loans tied to political concessions. In Berlin, the balance of power was shifting too. In 1888, Wilhelm II inherited the German throne. Within 2 years, he dismissed the cautious Bismarck and set out to make Germany a global empire. Where Bismarck had balanced alliances, Wilhelm craved glory, a navy to rival Britain's, colonies to match France's, and new friends beyond Europe's crowded stage. And in the Ottoman Sultan, he saw a partner. Wilhelm visited Istanbul twice, dazzling the court with military parades and promises of friendship. In 1898, he journeyed to the Holy Land, standing in Damascus to proclaim himself the friend of Islam. Ottoman papers called him Hacha Wilhelm, Wilhelm the Pilgrim, the Christian Kaiser who spoke like a believer. While Britain and France carved Ottoman lands, Germany offered flattery, engineers, and steel. To Abdulhamid, weary of humiliation, the Kaiser seemed less like a vulture and more like an ally. By the early 1900s, the Black Sea was a powder keg. Russia's dominance terrified the Ottomans, but Abdulhamid feared his own navy more than he feared the Tsar. The result was paralysis. The empire clung to the shore, watching as rival fleets carved up the seas around it. In hindsight, the irony is crushing. When war came in 1914, it would not be an army coup that drew the Ottomans into the abyss. It would be the very navy Abdulhamid mistrusted, reborn under German officers, striking Russia across the Black Sea. The raid that brought the empire into World War I was born from the rusting hulks Abdulhamid left to rot in the Horn. From his fortress atop Yildiz Hill, Abdulhamid ruled an empire through curtains and corridors. Ministers came and went like ghosts. Messages passed through servants and secretaries. Even his council meetings were staged, with hidden screens so the Sultan could watch unseen. He trusted few, saw plots everywhere, and rarely left the palace grounds. Yet, even in isolation, he built. Yildiz Palace became a prison world in miniature, a city of mosques, workshops, gardens, and schools. Within those walls he gathered engineers, clerks, and spies. He read dispatches, corrected reports in red ink, and personally approved which books could cross the frontier. Outside, his empire faltered. Inside, he crafted the illusion of control, and still the same pattern endured. The capital gleamed with telegraphs and gas lamps, but in Anatolia, peasants continued to starve under debt and misrule. The empire modernized, but always to sustain obedience. The Hijaz Railway, begun in 1900, was his proudest symbol, a sacred artery meant to unite the Muslim world from Damascus to Medina. Funded by donations from India to Java, it was heralded as the caliph's triumph. But again, the surface deceived. The line carried pilgrims more easily than grain. Its steel rails bound the empire symbolically, not economically. Every reform echoed a failed reform. New schools produced more clerks than craftsmen. Every teacher was an informant, every classroom a shrine to loyalty. And the same poverty, the same revolts, the same whispers of sedition spread as before. The Sultan's spies listened to it all. His secret police network, the Hafiya Teşkilatı, reached into every cafe and barracks. Fehim Pasha ruled Istanbul's streets like a gang lord, silencing dissent. Shakir Pasha oversaw informers across the provinces. Exiles vanished in Europe, students were dragged from dormitories at night, and even interpreters in foreign embassies reported to Yildiz. Abdulhamid justified it as survival. The empire, he told his council, was not sick, merely surrounded by thieves. He made the caliphate itself his shield. Pan-Islamic propaganda flooded the mosques. Sermons praising him as Ulu Hakan, the great Khan, the last true defender of Islam against the Christian world. Faith became diplomacy. When the Boxer Rebellion erupted in China, the Kaiser begged the Caliph to urge Muslim soldiers there to stay loyal to their European masters. Abdulhamid obliged, a quiet gesture that won him German favor and arms contracts. In 1901, even the United States appealed to him, asking the Caliph to restrain Muslim resistance in the newly conquered Philippines. The Sultan complied again. Europe called him a tyrant, but turned to him whenever faith could serve empire. It was the same hypocrisy the Ottomans had endured for a century, condemned in public, courted in secret. The same pattern repeated: modernize, submit, be humiliated, modernize again. And still the debts mounted. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration, born in 1881, had become a state within the state. A council of foreign bankers managing the empire's customs, tobacco and salt. Their offices rose higher than Ottoman ministries. Their ledgers carried more weight than decrees. Each year, more revenue flowed to London and Paris, while the Sultan's treasury shrank. Even the triumphs of the 1890s carried humiliation. Electric lights illuminated the mosques. Telephones connected ministries, all built on European loans. Abdulhamid's architects and engineers were foreign, his railways financed by creditors, his empire mortgaged to survive another day. He had become, as one diplomat sneered, the master of an empire he does not own. Still, Yildiz Palace glowed each night over the Bosphorus, and Istanbul looked reborn, but beneath the domes and palaces lay decay. Tax collectors bled the provinces, refugees from the Balkans and the Caucasus crowded the streets. Famine and resentment spread through Anatolia. In the cafes of Salonika and Beirut, exiled officers whispered of liberty, of revenge, of a new order to sweep away the Red Sultan's rule. History was repeating, the same illusions, the same fears, the same downward spiral dressed in new uniforms, and by century's end, the empire's real palace was not in Istanbul, but in the marble offices of the Public Debt Administration.
When Abdulhamid came to the throne in 1876, the empire was already bleeding money. The Crimean War, the lavish navy of Abdulaziz, and the endless Tanzimat projects had drained the treasury dry. By 1875, the empire had defaulted on its loans. Interest payments alone consumed more than half of the state's income, and still Europe demanded more. At first, the great powers threatened. Then they intervened. In 1881, the humiliation became law. The Muharrem Decree created a new institution, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, or Duyun-u-Umumiye-i Osmaniye İdaresi. Its purpose, they claimed, was to stabilize Ottoman finances. In truth, it was a foreign government inside the empire. The OPDA's headquarters rose proudly on the Grand Rue de Pera, a palace of marble and ledgers filled with French, British, Italian, Austrian and German officials. Its council represented the empire's creditors, not its people. These men, who spoke little or no Turkish, now had the legal right to collect and manage Ottoman revenues. Taxes on salt, tobacco and silk no longer flowed to the Sultan, but directly into European treasuries. Even the modest tolls of the Bosphorus were counted in francs and pounds. Ottoman tax collectors became mere agents of foreigners, bowing before inspectors from Paris and Vienna. For the first time in 5 centuries, the empire's finances were no longer in Muslim hands. The Caliph's army now marched with wages paid by Christian creditors. Abdulhamid raged, but he was powerless.
Without the OPDA, the empire would have starved. Its railways, schools, and even the lamps of Yıldız Palace burned on borrowed money. The Sultan who spied on his own people now found himself monitored by European accountants. The Red Sultan's hand still gripped the sword of Osman, but its edge was dull. Every reform he made, every loan he signed, came with foreign strings. The OPDA soon became a kingdom within a kingdom. Its foreign staff lived like pashas, immune to Ottoman law, collecting revenues from vast monopolies. In 1890, they created the Reji Company, seizing control of the empire's tobacco trade. Villagers who resisted the new taxes were arrested or shot by Ottoman gendarmes acting under European orders. The salt and tobacco that had sustained the empire now enriched those who called it a dying state. Pamphlets and underground journals mocked the situation mercilessly. Caricatures in Istanbul's coffee houses showed Abdulhamid as a marionette, his strings held by bankers in London and Paris. Even loyal officials began whispering that the caliphate had become a colony in all but name. Yet not all in Europe sought to humiliate him. In Berlin, a different kind of courtship was taking shape. Germany, still rising, still hungry for influence, offered partnership where others demanded payment. German engineers arrived to build the Baghdad Railway, a steel artery linking Constantinople to the Persian Gulf. German officers trained the Ottoman army. German banks financed factories, ports, and mines. To Berlin, the empire was not a corpse to be carved, but a patient to be revived, one who would remember his healer. Abdulhamid welcomed it. He did not trust Europe, but he could at least choose which power held the knife. Then, in 1901, came a proposal that struck deeper than all the rest. A letter arrived from Vienna bearing the name of Theodor Herzl, leader of the Zionist movement. He offered to erase half of the empire's debt in exchange for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. To Herzl and his backers, it was a transaction. To Abdulhamid, it was sacrilege. As caliph, guardian of the Muslim world, he could not sell the soil of Islam, least of all to a people whose return, he was warned, would defile the sanctity of Jerusalem. "I will not sell even a hand's breadth of land," he declared, "for it is not mine to sell, but belongs to the Ummah. Let them cut my body into pieces first." In a reign built on compromise, this was the one thing he would not yield, a refusal born not of politics, but of faith. Still, the arithmetic of empire was merciless. By 1907, the OPDA controlled nearly a third of Ottoman revenues. Its clerks, backed by European powers, dictated customs policy, import duties, even the pricing of wheat. Anatolia's villages starved while foreign shareholders debated profit margins in Paris. The empire's heart continued to beat, but each pulse was weaker than the last. Within the empire, rebellion began to ripen. The very schools Abdulhamid had built to create loyal servants produced the first revolutionaries. Officers trained in his military academies, men who had memorized his catechism of obedience, now questioned his authority. Railways carried not only troops, but pamphlets and ideas. The fear that had once united the empire was turning inward. By 1907, the cracks had widened beyond repair. The bureaucracy drowned in corruption, soldiers went unpaid, and the provinces muttered of famine and neglect. Europe continued to dictate policy through the public debt administration, while Germany tightened its influence through trade and military cooperation. To the conspirators in Macedonia, it was clear the Sultan had mortgaged not only the treasury, but the future. The revolution that took shape was not spontaneous. It was methodical, organized, an operation carried out by officers and bureaucrats who had studied how to seize a state from within. Railway stations were infiltrated, telegraph lines mapped, and sympathetic garrisons prepared. The empire that had once destroyed its janissaries was about to face rebellion from its own modern army. Inside Yıldız Palace, Abdulhamid still paced the marble corridors, revolver close at hand, the sword of Osman hanging above his desk, both symbols of a power that was no longer his. The empire's debt was paid in fear, its survival measured in interest rates, and the Sultan, who had once ruled through paranoia, now found himself trapped within it. The storm he had spent a lifetime suppressing was gathering beyond the palace gates, and this time, when the first shot was fired, it would not be in his name. In the quiet chambers of Dolmabahce Palace was a man who had waited his whole life for nothing. Prince Mehmed Reshad, brother of Abdulhamid II, nephew of Abdulaziz and son of Sultan Abdulhamid I, was now the last scion of a fading dynasty. Like his father, he was gentle, soft-spoken, and pious. But where Abdulhamid had ruled in an age of reform, Mehmed had lived most of his life behind locked doors. He was another product of the cafes, the cage, the ancient Ottoman custom that spared princes from death, but imprisoned them within the palace to prevent intrigue. It was mercy in name, exile in truth. For more than 30 years, Mehmed lived in quiet confinement, neither prisoner nor free man, walking the gardens of Turan Palace, studying theology and writing verses of Sufi poetry. While Abdulhamid ruled through fear, Mehmed survived through insignificance. When the Committee of Union and Progress deposed Abdulhamid in 1909, they needed a sultan who could bless their revolution, a symbol of continuity for a state now ruled by soldiers and bureaucrats. Mehmed understood immediately what his role would be. He would be the caliph in name, the sultan in ceremony, and a servant to those who called themselves his ministers. He was crowned Mehmed V, under the same constitution his brother had abolished 3 decades before. The crowds cheered, cannon fire echoed across the Bosphorus, and the empire once again spoke of renewal. But in his heart, Mehmed knew the truth. He was not chosen to rule, only to reassure. The age of the Padishahs had ended. From his first days on the throne, he performed his duty with quiet dignity. He opened parliaments he did not control, blessed troops whose loyalty belonged to the Committee of Union and Progress, and sat among ministers who looked not to their sultan for approval, but to the CUP. His speeches were written for him, his decrees drafted by others. The throne of Osman had become a stage prop. And yet, the people adored him. Here was a sultan who prayed in mosques, gave alms to the poor, and spoke softly of justice. For a brief moment, the empire saw in him what it longed to see in itself, a good man, patient and faithful, still standing amid ruin. Even European envoys found him disarming. Harmless, they said, a poet lost in ceremony. But Mehmed was no fool. The sword of Osman hung above his desk, its steel dulled by centuries. The parallels with the sword of Damocles were not lost on him. He understood what every sultan since Mahmud II had learned: power, even symbolic, carried peril, and every monarch before him had been consumed by the very empire they tried to save. From his window, he watched German officers drilling Ottoman soldiers along the Bosphorus, past German financiers whispering to ministers in the palace corridors, saw German engineers scurrying through the streets with blueprints for the Baghdad railway. It was the same Germany that had once courted his brother Abdulhamid, now weaving itself into every sinew of the state. The empire continued to be sustained by Europe, managed by it and slowly consumed by it. Beyond the palace walls, the familiar patterns returned. Britain ruled Egypt in his name. France tightened its hold on North Africa. Russia glared across the Black Sea, waiting. Every generation of Ottomans had sought reform as salvation. Every generation had found it led only to dependence. Sometimes, at night, attendants heard him pacing the marble corridors, reciting verses from the Quran. His prayers were not for victory or glory, but for peace, the one thing no sultan had been able to deliver. Perhaps he understood what others refused to see, that the empire was already a ghost, and he its caretaker.
When the Young Turks restored the 1876 constitution, Istanbul erupted in celebration. For the first time in decades, the press was free. Political prisoners were released. Exiles returned from Paris, London, and Cairo carrying newspapers and manifestos, convinced the empire could yet be reborn. In cafes and lecture halls, men spoke of liberty, equality, and Ottoman brotherhood. The empire, it seemed, had been given another chance.
Mehmed V watched from his palace balcony as crowds filled the streets below. His banners hung beside the flags of the committee. His portrait was carried beside that of Enver Pasha. For a moment, it seemed as if Sultan and people had been reconciled, the Caliph and the revolution walking hand in hand. But beneath the cheers, the fractures were already widening. The Committee of Union and Progress was no longer a secret society of idealists. It was an uneasy coalition of soldiers, bureaucrats, and intellectuals, bound together by ambition rather than unity. In Parliament, fiery liberals like Prince Sabahaddin demanded decentralization and minority rights, while hardliners in the CUP called for strong central rule under Turkish leadership. Armenians, Arabs, Greeks, and Jews sent deputies of their own, each demanding reform for their provinces. What had begun as a dream of Ottoman brotherhood quickly descended into a contest of grievances. To Mehmed, it was déjà vu. He had seen his brother Abdulhamid flirt with reform, only to smother it in fear. Now, in the name of liberty, the same disease was spreading again: suspicion, division, and the endless struggle for control. In April 1909, the illusion shattered. In Istanbul, mutinous soldiers and religious students rose up, demanding the restoration of Islamic law and the dismissal of the committee. They stormed parliament, executed officers in the streets, and shouted, "Long live the Sharia!" Mehmed, trapped in Dolmabahce, could hear the gunfire echoing across the Bosphorus. It was the 31st March incident, the first counter-revolution of the new regime. For 11 tense days, the city teetered between anarchy and civil war. Then, from Salonika, the so-called Action Army, loyal to the CUP, marched on Istanbul. Led by Mahmud Şevket Pasha, they entered the capital, crushed the uprising, and hanged its ringleaders in the public square. The parliament reassembled, trembling, and declared reaction defeated. Liberty, they said, had triumphed again. But as under Abdulhamid, it was a liberty drenched in blood. The committee that had promised reform and liberty and freedom became the very thing they promised to replace. It ruled through fear as much as faith, banning opposition newspapers, censoring critics, and exiling liberal deputies. The same ideals that had overthrown Abdulhamid were now used to justify their own repression. It was as if the ghost of the Blood Sultan had never left, only traded the palace for the parliament. Mehmed saw all of the hypocrisy from the marble halls of Dolmabahce. He opened new sessions of parliament with trembling hands, his voice echoing through chambers filled with men who no longer looked at him. He signed decrees drafted by strangers, attended parades where soldiers saluted him by habit, not reverence. His seal legitimized the actions of others, the symbol of divine rule reduced to a bureaucratic formality. Beyond the capital, the empire echoed the CUP. It too was splitting apart. In the Balkans, Christian nationalists plotted independence. In Anatolia, Armenians whispered of autonomy. In Arabia, tribal unrest simmered. European consuls spoke of protecting minorities, a phrase that now sounded like the prelude to invasion. The same words had been uttered before the Crimean War, before the Bulgarian uprisings, before the Russo-Turkish War. The pattern had returned. And it only took the Italians striking first to start the feeding frenzy. Italy, the youngest of Europe's imperial powers, turned its gaze southward to Ottoman Libya, the provinces of Tripolitania and Cyrenaica. The Italians called them unclaimed lands, rich in coastline and prestige, and declared that they would bring civilization where the Sultan had brought only neglect. In truth, they sought empire, a colonial prize to rival France and Britain. In the autumn of 1911, Italian warships appeared off Tripoli. When the Ottomans protested, Italy simply declared war. The empire, already stretched thin from the Balkans to Yemen, had no means to defend its distant provinces. The small Ottoman garrisons fought bravely, aided by local tribes and a few young officers, men like Enver and Mustafa Kemal, who would one day shape the empire's final battles. But they fought with rifles against artillery, with courage against steel. For the first time in history, airplanes flew in combat, Italian pilots dropping small bombs on Ottoman positions in the desert. War had entered a new age, and the empire could not keep up. Ottoman reinforcements tried to reach Libya but were intercepted by the Italian navy. The Mediterranean, once an Ottoman sea, was now a cage. After a year of resistance, the empire sued for peace. The Treaty of Auchi, signed in October 1912, forced the Ottomans to cede Libya and the Dodecanese Islands. It was another amputation disguised as diplomacy, another province gone, another humiliation endured. But the blow did not end with Tripoli. Across the Balkans, the small Christian kingdoms had watched Italy's easy victory and drawn their own conclusion. The Ottoman Empire was finished. If Italy could seize a province across the sea, surely Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece could take their own on land. Even before the ink dried on the treaty, their armies were already mobilizing. Inside Istanbul, the committee's unity unraveled completely. Enver dreamed of restoring the empire's glory through arms. Talat saw salvation in nationalism. Cemal, ever the pragmatist, believed in modernity at any cost. The liberals who had once preached freedom now whispered of dictatorship as the only path to survival. And Mehmed V, the caliph, the shadow of God, watched it all from behind his curtains. The constitution, the parliament, the promises of brotherhood, all of it had become a familiar play that continued over and over again. He was the actor who could not leave the stage, condemned to bless each new illusion of reform as the empire continued to dissolve before his eyes. He found quiet moments of peace where he could. Sometimes he would walk the corridors at night, stopping before the portraits of his ancestors. Warriors, conquerors, reformers. Mahmud, Abdulhamid, Abdulaziz, Abdulhamid. Each had fought to save the empire in their own way. Each had failed. He wondered if perhaps the throne itself had become a curse, that every generation of sultans was destined to inherit not power, but the duty to watch their inheritance burn again and again. By 1912, the illusion of unity was gone again. The constitution still existed, parliament still met, Mehmed still presided over ceremonies, but real power lay with the committee, divided, suspicious, and increasingly desperate. The reforms of 1909 had promised resurrection. Instead, they had delivered paralysis. And outside the palace, the storm clouds of war gathered again in the Balkans. Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro saw Ottoman troops collapse against Italy and prepared for war. The Ottoman Empire, drained, divided, and led by committees, would soon face the reckoning it had feared for a century. From the gilded halls of Dolmabahce, Mehmed V watched the storm gather. His empire was already losing a war with Italy, the Balkans seethed with revolt, and beyond them, Europe itself trembled. Every state armed, every alliance sharpened. It was as if the continent had forgotten peace, surrendering to an endless rhythm of conquest and reprisal, of revolutions devouring their children and empires devouring each other. And then, in the autumn of 1912, the Balkan states struck. Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro, old enemies, bound now by the opportunity they saw, formed the Balkan League and declared war on the Ottoman Empire. They claimed it was a crusade for liberation, but it was conquest in all but name. The first guns thundered along the Macedonian frontier. Within weeks, the empire's European army, poorly led, undermanned and starved of supplies, began to collapse. Even the German trained divisions, drilled and uniformed by Europe's finest officers, dissolved under fire. The world saw not modernization, but decay. The same Europe that had tutored the Ottomans in warfare now watched as its pupil bled. Refugees poured into Thrace. Men, women and children fleeing burning towns, trudging east toward Istanbul. The railways clogged with the displaced. Entire villages vanished beneath the smoke. The empire's oldest provinces, the heartland of Ottoman Europe, were gone in months. Mehmed V watched their columns wind along the Bosphorus like funeral processions for the empire itself. The soldiers fought bravely, but they were ghosts of the once proud army Mehmed the Conqueror had led into Europe. In October, the fortress city of Adrianople, Edirne, once the empire's proud second capital, fell. The flag of the crescent was torn down. To Mehmed, it was like watching his ancestors buried alive. In the capital, chaos reigned. Ministers quarreled, officers fled, and the CUP turned on itself. Enver demanded counterattack. Talaat demanded order. Cemal demanded discipline. Mehmed said nothing. He could not command. He could only pray. His attendants found him in the palace mosque at dawn, whispering verses from the Quran, while the city trembled with rumors of defeat and the ominous scent of coup d'etat. As recriminations filled the capital, Grand Vizier Kamil Pasha, the cautious old statesman who had served sultans and reformers alike, sought to spare what remained of the empire through diplomacy. Secretly, he opened talks with the great powers, proposing peace terms that would surrender Edirne to Bulgaria in exchange for an armistice. To the Committee of Union and Progress, already fractured and humiliated, the news was intolerable. In the cafes of Galata and the barracks of the capital, whispers of treason spread like fire, and by January 1913, the embers had become flame. Enver Bey, young and burning with fury, led a band of armed officers through the gates of the Sublime Porte, rifles hidden beneath their coats. The halls that once echoed with imperial decrees now rang with gunfire. In the confusion, the Minister of War, Nazim Pasha, was struck by a stray bullet and fell dead upon the staircase, his blood pooling beneath the domes where empires had once been governed. The Grand Vizier was seized, forced to sign his resignation, and the fate of the empire changed with the scratch of his pen. By nightfall, the coup was complete. Crowds outside hailed Enver as the savior of the nation. But it was not salvation. It was transformation. The empire had replaced failure with fanaticism. The Treaty of London in May 1913 left the empire with only a sliver of Europe, a defensive line at Satalka, within sight of Istanbul's minarets. Albania was carved out as a new state, the Balkans were gone, and the Ottoman flag was lowered across nearly all of Europe. For the first time in 5 centuries, the empire of the sultans no longer reached the Danube. In Berlin, generals noted how quickly the Ottoman army had fallen, mistaking humiliation for weakness, a lesson that would echo 2 years later when they dragged the same broken army into a world war. But the Balkan triumph did not last. As soon as the spoils were divided, the victors turned on each other. Bulgaria, dissatisfied with its share, invaded its former allies. The Second Balkan War erupted, a smaller, bloodier echo of the first. From the north, Romania invaded, its armies marching almost to Sofia. And in that chaos, the Ottomans struck back. Enver, still young and reckless, led a desperate offensive to retake Edirne. For a brief and bitter moment, the empire fought on the same side as the very nations that had destroyed it, bound not by alliance, but by vengeance and opportunism. Against all odds, they succeeded. The city returned to Ottoman hands, and Istanbul erupted in celebration. But it was hollow joy. The empire's borders had shrunk to Thrace and Anatolia. Europe, the lands of the Sultan's birthright, was gone forever. and the great powers watched in silence. Russia, the self-proclaimed protector of the Slavs, let the slaughter unfold, eager to punish Bulgaria for its greed and for daring to act without permission. It was a warning dressed as indifference. In the Balkans, no one fought without the blessing of Europe. When the war ended in August 1913, Bulgaria was broken, its ambition crushed, and the Ottoman flag once again flew over Edirne. It was a victory without joy, a relic of empire reclaimed, but surrounded by enemies and ruins. Mehmed offered prayers of thanks, but in his heart he knew this triumph changed nothing. The empire had not been reborn, only granted a final breath before the storm. He received the casualty lists with trembling hands, as if reading the names of his own children. The Balkan Wars were not only a defeat of armies, but of centuries, the final unraveling of the empire his ancestors had built, sword by sword, prayer by prayer. When the treaties were signed in 1913, the map of Europe had changed again. The Balkans were aflame with new nations, each claiming victory, each scarred by slaughter. And yet, across the continent, men cheered their armies, sang of glory, and dreamed of their own wars to come. The Balkans had merely gone first. The disease of nationalism was spreading, and soon all of Europe would catch the fever. In Istanbul, the committee grew darker. They blamed the defeat not on themselves, but on traitors, minorities, and the weakness of parliament. The anti-Christian sentiment deepened, fueled by the memory that it was Christian nations, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, that had torn the empire apart. Inside the CUP, whispers spread that disloyal hearts had weakened the state from within. What began as suspicion would soon harden into ideology and eventually into vengeance. And Mehmed, the gentle poet, the caliph in name only, stood alone in his palace, surrounded by portraits of his ancestors. He saw in the Balkan Wars not only the end of Ottoman Europe, but the beginning of Europe's end. As he watched the continent continue to bleed and descend into madness, he wondered if perhaps it was Europe that was sick. First Balkan War had been a disaster beyond reckoning. Towns burned, the army in retreat, the capital trembling. The Committee of Union and Progress, triumphant reformers only 4 years before, now stood accused of incompetence and betrayal. The streets of Istanbul seethed with anger. Newspapers denounced the ministers. Crowds shouted for their resignation. The same voices that had once cried, "Long live liberty," now demanded vengeance. Inside Dolmabahce, Sultan Mehmed V moved like a ghost through marble corridors. His empire's faith in reform was broken, and even his prayers felt hollow. From his windows he could see soldiers bivouacked along the Bosphorus, cold, hungry, leaderless. He had seen this before, a government collapsing under its own ideals, just as it had under his brother, Abdulhamid. Reform, once again, had birthed ruin. The crisis came in January 1913. The cabinet had gathered at the Sublime Porte, the symbolic heart of Ottoman government, to debate the latest humiliation, surrendering Edirne, the empire's ancient second capital, to the Bulgarians. Outside, the city seethed with anger. Crowds filled the streets, shouting, "Edirne cannot fall." Soldiers muttered in the barracks, clerks in the ministries. Istanbul was choking on the memory of defeat. Grand Vizier Kamil Pasha, a cautious Anglophile statesman, sought peace at any cost. He began secret negotiations with the European powers, negotiations that would surrender Adrianople to Bulgaria. When word reached the committee, fury erupted. To them, Kamil's diplomacy was treason, treason that had to be answered for. On a cold afternoon, Enver Bey, not yet a pasha, but already a legend to the public, strode through the gates of the Sublime Porte with a band of armed officers and CUP militants. They were dressed in civilian coats, rifles hidden under them, their faces set with purpose. Inside, the Grand Vizier Kamil Pasha presided over the meeting, his government already wavering between capitulation and collapse. Enver burst into the chamber, shouting that the nation had been betrayed. "Edirne will not be given up," he declared, his voice echoing through the marble corridors. The ministers froze, some stunned, others secretly relieved. In the chaos that followed, gunfire erupted on the staircase. The Minister of War, Nazim Pasha, was shot and killed in the confusion, his blood staining the tiles of the building that had once embodied Ottoman order. The sound of the shots carried through the streets. Within minutes, the city knew. Kamil Pasha, trembling, was forced to sign his resignation on the spot. Outside, CUP sympathizers flooded the square, hailing Enver as a hero who had saved the nation. But it was not salvation, it was the birth of a new dictatorship. Within hours, the government belonged to the committee once more, not through election or persuasion, but through the muzzle of a gun. Outside, Enver was hailed as a hero. Crowds cheered him as the savior of the nation, the man who had avenged humiliation. Talat and Cemal quickly joined him at the center of power. Together they became the new triumvirate, the three pashas who would dominate the empire's final years. They spoke of discipline, unity, and regeneration. But beneath the slogans lay something darker: paranoia, resentment, and an obsession with enemies, both within and without. The lamps burned late in the palace, where Mehmed received the news in silence. Another revolution and change in leadership had come, not with decrees or constitutions, but with blood and steel. He said nothing. He simply signed the decrees placed before him, dismissing Kamil Pasha and appointing Mahmud Shevket Pasha as Grand Vizier, and went back to his prayers. The Sultan knew his role: to bless whatever outcome fate delivered, to play the caliph while others ruled in his name. The halls of the palace trembled not with shouts of rebellion, but with the echo of a pen scratching across parchment. He thought of his father Abdulhamid, who had reigned through reform, of his brother Abdulhamid, who had ruled through fear, and now of these new men who governed through violence, a multi-headed hydra that seemed just as likely to devour itself. Each believed they were saving the empire. Each had drawn their sword against its decay, and each, in the end, had only hastened it. When Mahmud Shevket Pasha was assassinated a few months later, the new regime didn't let the opportunity go to waste. They responded with mass arrests, executions, and a purge of the opposition. The parliament still sat, the constitution still stood, but both were now hollow forms. Newspapers were censored, critics silenced, minorities blamed. The CUP that had overthrown tyranny had become its mirror image, and yet out of this storm, they won their first victory. In the summer of 1913, as Bulgaria quarreled with its former allies, Enver led Ottoman troops back into Thrace. Against all odds, Edirne, the empire's old capital lost only months before, was retaken. The recapture electrified the nation. Istanbul erupted in celebration. Crowds wept in the streets. Enver rode into the city, hailed as the hero of Adrianople. The new regime, born in blood, was baptized in triumph. But to Mehmed V, it was a bitter victory. The price had been another coup, another killing, another round of promises written in blood. He presided over parades and offered prayers of thanks, but in his heart he felt the same dread that had haunted every sultan before him, the knowledge that each triumph only delayed the inevitable. From the palace, he watched the three pashas consolidate their rule. Enver at the head of the army, Talat in control of the interior, Cemal commanding the capital. The old empire of sultans had been replaced by an empire of committees, men who ruled through ambition rather than birthright. Mehmed remained the face of the state, but the state itself no longer had a soul. By the end of 1913, the empire stood momentarily whole again, although greatly reduced in size, and its wounds ran deeper than ever. The constitutional dream was dead. Power now lay in the hands of soldiers. The CUP spoke of national rebirth, but the air in Istanbul was thick with fire and fear. The age of reform had ended in a dictatorship wearing the mask of progress. And in the quiet of Dolmabahce, Mehmed continued to walk the halls quietly and seeking quiet where he could. As he made his way to prayer and time of solace, he noticed the increase of Deutsch spoken in the palace and the talk of Krupp weapons. For decades, the empire had leaned toward Germany. Abdulhamid II had begun the courtship, inviting German engineers, officers, and financiers. Now, under Mehmed V, that relationship deepened out of necessity. Britain and France held the Ottoman purse strings. Russia waited like a wolf at the Bosphorus, and the Germans alone still spoke of partnership, or at least pretended to. But beyond the palace walls, Europe itself was sick. The continent had entered an age of armed paranoia. Since the turn of the century, alliances had hardened into cages. Germany and Austria, Hungary on one side, France, Russia, and Britain on the other, the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. Each promised peace through strength, each prepared for war through fear. Crises followed one another like drumbeats. In 1905, Germany had challenged France in Morocco. In 1908, Austria had annexed Bosnia and enraged the Slavs. In 1909, Russia had tasted humiliation and vowed revenge. In 1911, Italy had invaded Ottoman Libya, showing the Balkans how easily the old empire could still be carved apart. Across the North Sea, dreadnoughts multiplied as Britain and Germany raced to outbuild each other in steel, every state armed, every alliance sharpened. It was as if Europe had forgotten peace, surrendering to an endless rhythm of land grab and reprisal, of revolutions devouring their children and empires devouring themselves. To Mehmed, watching from his quiet palace on the Bosphorus, it felt like déjà vu on a continental scale. What his empire had endured for a century, reform, debt, suspicion, collapse, Europe was now reenacting in grander form. The same madness that had consumed the Ottomans was spreading westward, and amid that gathering storm, the empire drew still closer to Berlin. German officers already filled the barracks, Krupp guns already armed the forts. Now, in late 1913, came the final symbol of dependence. General Lehmann von Sanders, sent by the Kaiser to command the Ottoman First Army itself. The appointment nearly set Europe alight. Russia raged that a German general would guard the Bosphorus, its sacred gateway to the Mediterranean. The newspapers of St. Petersburg called it provocation. The Tsar's ministers whispered of mobilization. For weeks, diplomats scrambled to calm the crisis. The world stepped back from war, but only for a moment. Inside Istanbul, the arrival of the German mission was greeted with ceremony. Cemal Pasha hosted parades along the Golden Horn. The CUP press proclaimed a new dawn of progress. German flags fluttered beside Ottoman banners as officers toasted one another in the gardens of the German embassy. But beneath the pageantry, everyone knew what it meant. The empire was no longer merely befriending Germany, it was being absorbed by it. Across the Black Sea, tension deepened further. The Ottoman navy was undergoing its own rebirth, funded not by the state, but by the people themselves. Across Anatolia and Thrace, farmers, merchants, and soldiers donated coins and heirlooms to finance two great dreadnoughts being built in British shipyards, Reshadieh and Sultan Osman I. They were to be symbols of renewal, floating proof that the empire still had pride and future. But even these ships, bought with the people's hope, became tools of division. Russia watched their progress with alarm, Britain with quiet unease. The Black Sea had become a mirror of Europe's anxiety, where every ripple carried the reflection of an approaching storm. From his windows at Dolmabahce, Mehmed watched the courtyards fill with the clipped rhythm of German commands. He passed ministers who now spoke more Deutsch than Turkish. He heard talk of Krupp shells, Mauser rifles and steel rails pushing ever eastward toward Baghdad. The empire was modernizing, and again under another's will. He thought of his father Abdulhamid, who had placed his faith in French and English civilization, of his brother Abdulhamid, who had turned to German strength. Now he stood between both legacies, a debtor to the West, a client to Berlin. Reform had always promised independence, it had always delivered chains, and still the world's pulse quickened. By the spring of 1914, Europe was a continent sleepwalking into catastrophe. In Vienna, the aging Emperor Franz Joseph prepared a ceremonial visit to Bosnia. His nephew, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, would travel to Sarajevo that June, a trip meant to display imperial confidence in a province once Ottoman, now Austrian. Few realized it would ignite the world. From Istanbul, Mehmed watched the reports with unease. He sensed the shape of what was coming, a quarrel that would not stay confined to the Balkans. The armies were too large, the alliances too rigid, the hatred too old. The next war would not be limited, it would be total. And yet within the empire, the pashas spoke only of opportunity. They believed a coming European war could save the Ottomans, that by siding with the right power, the empire might reclaim its place among nations. But which side, and at what cost, they had not yet decided. Sometimes at dusk, attendants found Mehmed alone before the palace windows, gazing across the Bosphorus as troop drills echoed through the courtyards below. He murmured that same old prayer, not for victory, not for vengeance, but for time. But time was running out. The continent's fuse had already been lit, its powder laid across every frontier, every fleet, every throne. The Ottomans would not escape it. He knew it was coming. Every sultan since Mahmud II had sensed the same shadow before their fall, that low, gathering hum of destiny. The empire had once feared its enemies within, now it was chained to its enemies without. Mehmed could see it all unfolding, the same arrogance, the same faith in reform, the same blindness to ruin. And though he carried the title of caliph, he ruled nothing. His ministers looked to Berlin for approval, not to Allah for wisdom. The promise of power was just another illusion, one last masquerade before the march to destruction began. The Ottoman Empire began 1914 in uneasy recovery. The scars of the Balkan Wars were still fresh, the treasury nearly empty. The army, though reformed, was untested. Yet on the surface there was calm. The streets of Istanbul thrummed with commerce, ministers posed for photographs, and foreign envoys wrote home that the empire seemed stable at last. It was an illusion, a masquerade masking exhaustion. Of the ruling triumvirate, Enver Pasha shone brightest, and cast the longest shadow. Barely in his 30s, he had risen from minor officer to minister of war through brilliance, charm, and calculation. A hero of the war against the Italians and saver of Edirne, his years as a military attaché in Berlin had left their mark. He admired German precision, German discipline, and above all, German will. But even as he idolized their methods, he distrusted their motives. He believed the Ottomans could learn from Germany, not serve it. His early exchanges with General Lyman von Sanders made that tension clear. To Enver, the Prussian general's command of Ottoman troops was both an insult and a challenge. He studied Sanders as much as he obeyed him, the apprentice already imagining himself the master. When Enver replaced Mahmud Shevket as Minister of War, his rivalry with Liman deepened. Now, at last, He was the Germans' equal in title, if not in age. Throughout 1914, the empire walked a diplomatic tightrope. Cemal courted France, promising stability and trade. Talaat reached out to Britain, hoping to ease debt payments. Enver spoke softly to the Germans, and they listened most closely. The empire's neutrality was public, but its desperation was an open secret. Surrounded by enemies, isolated from allies, the Ottomans searched for anyone who would treat them as equals. By summer, only Berlin offered that illusion. Then came Sarajevo. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was shot dead in a city that had once been Ottoman. The sound of those bullets echoed across Europe and deep into the halls of the Sublime Porte. At first, Istanbul reacted cautiously. The newspapers printed brief reports. Ministers met, anxious but uncertain. The empire was still rebuilding. Another European war could shatter it completely. But as the July crisis unfolded, it became clear that war was inevitable, and the Ottomans would not be allowed to stand apart forever. Each day brought new telegrams and new threats. Austria prepared to strike Serbia, Russia mobilized, Germany guaranteed its ally, France and Britain hesitated, then armed. Within weeks, the world teetered on the edge of catastrophe. The Ottoman cabinet met in endless session, torn between isolation and alliance. Some urged neutrality. A war of the great powers might bleed them all, leaving the empire to recover in peace. Others saw opportunity, a chance to reclaim lost provinces, to avenge humiliation, to gamble one last time for survival. Since the assassination of Mahmud Shevket Pasha, there was no one left to restrain the committee. The sword had fully replaced the pen. Enver was the loudest among them. He argued that neutrality was death by delay. Germany's victory, he said, was inevitable, and with it, the resurrection of the Ottoman Empire. His words carried weight, but not certainty. Talaat hesitated. Cemal distrusted Berlin. Mehmed V, as always, prayed for peace. The empire tried every door. Ottoman envoys in London sought an alliance with Britain. They were politely refused. France offered sympathy, not support. Russia's diplomats remained cold. Even Germany initially declined before Haji Wilhelm told his ministers to reconsider. On August 2, 1914, a secret treaty was signed in Istanbul, binding the Ottoman Empire to Germany in the event of a Russian attack. It was a pact made in fear, sealed in hope, and hidden from nearly everyone, even from the Sultan himself. Days later, informal talks with Bulgaria hinted at cooperation, a quiet understanding that neither would move against the other as the war spread. Still, officially, the empire was neutral. The people were told nothing. The mosques prayed for peace. But in the ministries and barracks, the masquerade was cracking. Then came betrayal. For years, the empire had poured what little wealth it had into two great dreadnoughts, the Reshadia and the Sultan Osman, symbols of pride, built in British shipyards and paid for by public donations. Farmers had sold their tools, merchants their heirlooms. When Britain declared war, Churchill seized both ships for his own navy. The Ottoman flag was never raised over them. Across the empire, the outrage was volcanic. Crowds burned British flags in the streets. The betrayal pushed Istanbul closer to Berlin than any treaty could have. Germany moved swiftly to fill the void. Two of its own warships and crew, the Goeben and the Breslau, evaded the Royal Navy and appeared at the mouth of the Dardanelles. Pursued and desperate, they sought refuge in Ottoman waters. Enver saw opportunity. The ships were declared gifts to the Ottoman fleet, their German crews quietly retained. Berlin called it friendship. London called it deceit. Mehmed V was told it was a diplomatic gesture. He blessed it, though he did not believe it. So they opened the straits to the dreadnoughts, sealing their safe passage and evasion of the British Navy. Enver ordered offers of alliance to be sent to Russia, followed by a closing of the Turkish Straits to international shipping under the guise of minesweeping operations. By the summer of 1914, more than 80 German officers wore Ottoman uniforms, advisors in name, commanders in practice. German ships lay anchored in its harbors, German gold filled its treasury. The pashas called it partnership, but to Mehmed he could see what was coming. From his window at Dolmabahce, he watched the ship's black funnels rising above the Bosphorus and murmured the same prayer he had spoken since his coronation: that peace might hold, that reason might prevail, that the empire might be spared one last war. He could feel the weight of history pressing down, as it had on every sultan before him, that same cold certainty that the empire was being drawn, step by step, toward its end. In the corridors of Dolmabahce, he sometimes passed Enver late at night, still in uniform, maps spread across his desk. The young pasha would smile and bow deeply, his eyes bright with purpose and glory. The sultan would nod in silence. He had seen those eyes before, in Mahmud, in Abdulhamid, in every man who believed the empire could still be saved by force. He sensed a shift in the courtyards, plans of raids, of a coming strike that would bind the empire's fate to Germany forever. The report spoke of Russian patrols along the Black Sea, and behind every door, whispers grew. It would begin with a coded message slid along a desk, a single order, if a suitable opportunity presented itself.
By the autumn of 1914, the Ottoman Empire was neutral only in name. German officers occupied its ministries. Nearly every Ottoman army corps had at least one German advisor, and in the harbors of Istanbul, two dark silhouettes waited at anchor, the battlecruiser Goeben and the light cruiser Breslau, newly rechristened Yavuz Sultan Selim and Midili. Their black hulls gleamed beneath the Bosphorus sun, the most modern ships ever to fly the crescent moon, and the most dangerous. Their journey had already become legend. Pursued by the British Mediterranean fleet in early August, they had dashed across the sea under Admiral Wilhelm Souchon, slipping through the Dardanelles just ahead of their hunters. Once inside, the Ottoman government, still officially neutral, faced a choice that could destroy them either way. To reject the ships was to defy Germany. To accept them was to invite war with Britain. Enver chose the latter. The ships were sold to the empire for 80 million marks, their German crews ceremonially donning fezzes and swearing loyalty to Sultan Mehmed V, though their hearts and their orders remained with Berlin. Admiral Souchon was officially appointed commander of the Ottoman fleet on September 23rd, a formality that confirmed what was already true, that the German admiral now commanded the empire's navy. He sent coded dispatches to Berlin through the embassy, bypassing Ottoman channels entirely. Enver Pasha, now Minister of War, knew it, tolerated it, and quietly encouraged it. Between them, a dangerous understanding took root, one that would soon drag the empire into the inferno. By late October, the pressure on Enver was unbearable. The secret alliance with Germany, signed on August 2nd, required Ottoman intervention if Russia attacked, but Russia had not. Berlin grew restless. Ambassador Hans von Wangenheim pressed Enver to act first, to strike Russia and claim defense. Lehmann von Sanders cautioned restraint, warning that a single misstep could doom the empire. Enver ignored him, restless and convinced that destiny favored him, made his decision. On October 24th, he summoned Admiral Souchon to the War Ministry. The two men spoke alone beneath the flickering lamplight. Enver said only, "If the opportunity arises to strike the Russians, do not hesitate." Souchon saluted, saying nothing of the orders he had already received from Berlin to do exactly that. 3 nights later, the fleet slipped silently through the Bosphorus and into the Black Sea.
Their lights were doused, their guns covered, their signals dead. What followed was not an act of provocation, but of war. Concealed by the mist of dawn on October 29, 1914, the Yavuz Sultan Selim loosed 47 shells into the forts of Sevastopol, the thunder echoing across the Crimean hills. The Medili struck Odessa and Theodosia, sinking the gunboat Prut and setting the oil tanks ablaze. Destroyers bombarded Novorossiysk until its docks vanished in flame. For 6 hours the Black Sea roared with Ottoman guns, German guns, and the cry of Feuer frei. By sunset, the Black Sea was covered in smoke, and the two empires were bound by blood. When word reached Istanbul the following morning, the government was paralyzed. Grand Vizier Said Halim Pasha, a cautious, scholarly man, was woken by a frantic aide bearing a telegram stamped "Most Urgent." The message from the governor of Zonguldak read simply, "Enemy harbors bombarded. The fleet has opened hostilities." Within an hour, the cabinet assembled in the Sublime Porte. Enver arrived fashionably late, immaculate in his uniform, a faint smile on his lips. Said Halim demanded an explanation. Enver, cool and deliberate, replied that Russian mines had been discovered off the coast of Eregli, a provocation requiring immediate retaliation. Talaat Pasha stared at him in disbelief. Shamal Pasha cursed under his breath. The ministers spoke over one another, their voices rising in panic and fury. Then the Russian ambassador, Mikhail Gears, arrived uninvited, his carriage still splattered with rain from the streets. He burst into the chamber, waving telegrams from Sevastopol and Odessa. "Your fleet," he shouted, "has attacked us without warning." Enver, unflinching, responded, "It was Russia who opened fire. We have merely defended ourselves." It was a lie, and everyone in the room knew it. That evening, Enver wrote a letter to the German ambassador Wangenheim. "The fleet has fulfilled its duty. The situation is now beyond recall. May His Majesty the Kaiser be assured of our loyalty. I await your counsel for the next step." The next morning, Haji Wilhelm replied with congratulations. The die was cast. Enver sent a telegram to all army commands. "A state of war now exists with Russia. Commence full mobilization at once." Russia's declaration had come on November 2nd. Britain and France followed on the 5th. The empire was now at war with the world. On November 14th, 1914, in the courtyard of the mosque at Topkapi Palace, the Sultan Caliph of Islam stood before an empire at war. Beneath the winter sun, thousands of soldiers, clerics, and officials gathered as the imperial decree was read aloud. The fatwa, ornate, solemn, and absolute, declared jihad upon the enemies of Islam. "The time has come," it said, "to defend the faith and the caliphate against the infidels who seek its destruction." The crowd shouted, "Allahu Akbar," as cannon fire echoed from the Bosphorus. But the voice that followed, trembling and weary, belonged to an old man who had outlived the truth behind his own words. Sultan Mehmed V, sharing the name of the great Mehmed the Conqueror, cast a completely different shadow. Gentle, uncertain, a poet forced into history, he knew that this holy war was not born of faith, but of desperation. This was not 1683. The army seemed fractured, the navy obsolete, and the treasury hollow. Arab provinces simmered with unrest. Anatolia was exhausted, and the empire's fate now rested in Berlin's hands. Germany had promised miracles. Its diplomats told the Sultan and his ministers that the call to jihad would shake the British Empire to its core. They spoke of revolt in India, uprising in Egypt, rebellion in Sudan, millions of Muslims rising at the Sultan's command. But it was fantasy. The Holy War was propaganda dressed as prophecy, a German strategy spoken through Ottoman lips. The fatwa would stir passions, but no great uprising came. From Cairo to Delhi, the Muslim world remained silent. The empire had declared a war for Islam and found itself fighting alone. Mehmed's proclamation was both a beginning and an ending, the last echo of the empire that had once ruled 3 continents in the name of Allah. And behind the pageantry of faith lay the true story of its fall, a century of rulers, each convinced they could save it. Mahmud II had begun the long march toward modernity. He had destroyed the Janissaries, the empire's oldest warriors, believing that by killing the past he could create a future. His son, Abdulhamid I, opened the gates to Europe, drafting reforms and borrowing wealth in pursuit of civilization. He believed the empire could join the modern world, but it only became its debtor. Abdulaziz followed, dazzled by industry and empire. He built railways and ironclads, filling harbors with ships he could not afford, hoping to become Hukmdar-i-Bahriye. When he fell, the empire inherited his debts and his delusions. Then came Abdulhamid II, the Red Sultan, the Blood Sultan, who tried to save the empire through fear. He built spies instead of schools, prisons instead of progress. He saw enemies everywhere and, in time, created them. And now Mehmed V, the gentle, reluctant heir, had spent his reign watching their legacies collapse into one final gamble: alliance with Germany, war with the world, and jihad as a weapon of last resort. Each sultan had believed in salvation through reform or control. Each had mistaken movement for progress and survival for strength. They had borrowed from Europe, armed like Europe and ruled like Europe, and still fell to the same disease: ambition without unity, reform without peace, power without control. The empire did not collapse because it refused to change. It collapsed because it could not stop changing, because it had long forgotten what it meant to simply endure. And yet, as the war began, the soldiers of the empire marched with a Prussian fire that no foreigner had expected. They were not the broken, feeble armies of the Balkan Wars. Under German training and Enver's ruthless reforms, discipline had returned, harsh, efficient, and unrelenting. From Damascus to Erzurum, the call to arms spread, and the old empire stirred again. Few among them knew what they were fighting for. Fewer still understood how little was left to fight for. But when they marched to the front, they carried something their empire had long forgotten: belief. It was not faith in victory or even in survival, but in the idea that perhaps this war, this one last struggle, could give meaning to all that had been lost. From the palace at Dolmabahce, Mehmed watched them depart, the last army of the caliphs, marching beneath the green banner of Islam and the black smoke of German coal. He whispered a prayer for mercy, not for triumph, wondering how history would see him. He knew the empire could not win, but like so many of his forebears, he could not imagine surrender. This was the final act of the Ottoman story, an empire that refused to die quietly. It reformed, it borrowed, it modernized, it dreamed. And at last, it went to war, not for glory, but because it had no other choice. The empire that once called itself eternal was undone not by its enemies, but by itself. But the Ottoman tragedy was not unique. To the north, another empire was breaking under the same weight, revolutions within doing as much damage as armies abroad. The bruised bear of Europe, the Russian Empire, would follow the same road.